Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Hoh Rainforest of Olympic National Park, Washington, 3 months ago, but I still wake up screaming Jake's name every night, clawing at sheets soaked in cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to escape. Jake Henley had been my best friend since our sophomore year at Washington State. We met in a statistics class neither of us wanted to take, bonded over our mutual hatred of probability calculations and our shared love of terrible horror movies. For 7 years, we'd been inseparable. Roommates in college, best man at each other's weddings, the guy you called when life got too heavy to carry alone. Jake was the outdoorsman between us, the one who dragged me away from my computer every few months to remind me that fresh air existed. He had this infectious enthusiasm about the wilderness, always saying it was where you could find your true self, where the noise of civilization couldn't drown out the voice in your head that actually mattered. I wish I'd never found mine. We'd been planning this trip for 2 years, 3 days backpacking through the temperate rainforest, away from our desk jobs at competing tech companies and the suffocating routine of Seattle life. Jake had researched every mile of trail, studied weather patterns, even contacted park rangers about current conditions. He approached wilderness adventures the same way he approached everything else, with meticulous preparation and boundless optimism. "This is going to be perfect, Mike," he'd said over beers the week before we left. "No cell service, no emails, no deadlines. Just us, the forest, and enough time to remember who we are when nobody's watching." His girlfriend Sarah had rolled her eyes at this, but she was smiling. "You two and your Boy Scout adventures. Just try to come back with all your limbs attached, okay?" "That's the plan," Jake had laughed, raising his beer in a mock toast. "To coming back intact." We started the Hoh River Trail on a Thursday morning in early October. The forecast called for clear skies, unusual for the Pacific Northwest that time of year, and Jake took it as a good omen. We'd driven up from Seattle in his Subaru, loaded with gear that had cost us both more than we wanted to admit to our wives. Jake was practically bouncing with excitement as we shouldered our packs at the trailhead, the moss-draped Sitka spruces towering above us like the columns of some ancient cathedral. The air smelled of cedar and decomposing leaves, that rich, earthy scent that makes you feel small and ancient all at once. 17 miles to the Blue Glacier, Jake said, consulting his GPS device, a top-of-the-line Garmin he'd saved up for months to buy. "We'll camp at Elk Lake tonight, push to the glacier overlook tomorrow, then loop back through the Salduke drainage. Perfect weather for it, too." He gestured at the patches of blue sky visible through the canopy. "When's the last time you saw the Olympics this clear?" I adjusted my pack straps, feeling the weight settle across my shoulders. 40 pounds of gear, food, and water for 3 days. Jake carried more, insisting on taking the heavier items despite my protests. That was Jake, always looking out for everyone else, even when it cost him. In college, he'd been the one who made sure everyone got home safe after parties. At work, he was the guy who stayed late to help struggling coworkers with their projects. His ex-wife used to joke that Jake would give you the shirt off his back, even if it was the only shirt he owned. "You sure about that weight distribution?" I asked, watching him adjust his fully loaded pack with practiced ease. "I'm good, Mike. Besides, you're carrying the beer. 2 cans hardly counts as it's the principle of the thing." The first few hours were everything Jake had promised. We followed the river through groves of massive western hemlocks, their trunks so wide that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in cathedral rays, illuminating patches of ferns and moss that looked almost primordial. Elk droppings dotted the trail, and Jake pointed out fresh bear tracks in the mud, his voice carrying the excitement of a kid at a zoo. "Black bear," he said, kneeling to examine the prints. "Probably went through here this morning. See how clear the pad marks are? That means the mud was still soft from last night's dew. I nodded, pretending I could see what he was talking about. Jake had taught himself wilderness skills the way other people learned foreign languages, with complete dedication and an almost obsessive attention to detail. He could identify animal tracks, predict weather patterns from cloud formations, start a fire with nothing but friction and tinder. Skills that seemed romantic and adventurous when discussed over coffee in the city, but took on a different significance out here where they might actually matter. We talked about normal things as we hiked: work stress, relationship problems, plans for the future. Jake was thinking about proposing to Sarah, had been carrying the ring around for months but couldn't find the right moment. I was dealing with my own marital issues, the slow drift that happens when two people get so busy with their careers they forget they're supposed to be building a life together. "Maybe that's what this is really about," Jake said around mile 4, stopping to take a swig from his water bottle. "Getting away from all the noise so we can actually think clearly for once." Deep thoughts from the philosopher of the Pacific Northwest. Mock me all you want, but when's the last time you went 3 days without checking your phone? He had a point. I'd already reflexively reached for my phone twice, forgetting that we were well outside cell tower range. The absence of that constant digital tether felt strange, like missing a limb I'd grown accustomed to having. It was around mile 7 that things started feeling off. Jake had been checking his GPS regularly, a habit that had annoyed me earlier but now seemed reassuring. Suddenly, he stopped and frowned at the device, turning it this way and that as if better reception might be found in a different orientation. "Weird," he muttered, shaking the unit with the frustrated gesture of someone whose technology had just betrayed them. "What's wrong?" "GPS says we're off trail, but we haven't left the path once." He looked up at the canopy, then back at the device. "Must be the tree cover interfering with the satellites. These old-growth trees can play hell with GPS signals." We consulted our paper map, a USGS topographical sheet we'd studied for weeks in preparation. Jake spread it across a fallen log, weighing down the corners with rocks. But something was wrong. The contour lines seemed different somehow, arranged in patterns that didn't match what I remembered from our planning sessions. The elevation markers were in different positions, and the blue line indicating the river seemed to curve in ways that didn't match the water flowing beside us. "This doesn't look right," I said, running my finger along what should have been our route. Jake frowned, comparing the map to our surroundings. "Maybe we got an old edition. Sometimes they reprint these things with outdated information." But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe it. We'd bought this map directly from the Park Service 2 weeks ago. It should have been current. The trail markers we'd been following, small brown signs with white lettering indicating distances and destinations, suddenly looked different too. Faded, weathered, like they'd been placed decades ago instead of maintained by the Park Service. The lettering was harder to read, and some of the signs seemed to point in directions that didn't make sense based on our understanding of the trail system. "We're fine," Jake said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty I'd never heard before. In all the years I'd known him, Jake had been the guy with the plan, the one who thought 3 steps ahead and always had a backup. Hearing doubt in his voice was like watching a fundamental law of physics break down. "The river's right there. We just follow it upstream to Elk Lake." By late afternoon, we should have reached our planned campsite. Instead, we found ourselves in a grove of dead trees. Not the lush rainforest we'd been hiking through all day. The trunks were blackened and twisted, reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. No leaves, no moss, no life. Even the omnipresent ferns that carpeted the forest floor elsewhere were absent here, leaving only bare earth and scattered deadfall. The silence was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the river had somehow faded to a distant whisper, though it should have been right beside us. "This isn't right," I said, stating the obvious. The air here felt different, thinner, colder. My breath came out in visible puffs despite the mild October temperature that had been comfortable just minutes before. Jake's face had gone pale. He kept spinning in circles, looking for some landmark that made sense, some feature that would connect this dead place to the living forest we'd been walking through. The trail was right here. I know it was right here. We backtracked for an hour, but somehow couldn't find the path we'd been following. It was as if the trail had simply ceased to exist behind us. Worse, the landscape seemed to shift around us in ways that defied logic. Trees I was certain we'd passed before appeared in different configurations. Boulders that should have served as landmarks had moved. The river, which should have been our constant guide north, seemed to flow in the wrong direction. "This is impossible," Jake said, his voice tight with frustration and something that might have been fear. "You can't just lose a trail. Trails don't disappear." But apparently they could. As darkness crept through the forest, we made the decision to set up camp in the small clearing surrounded by those dead trees. It wasn't ideal. The ground was hard, without the soft duff of normal forest floor, and the twisted trunks created an unsettling silhouette against the darkening sky. But we were losing light, and the thought of trying to navigate in the dark was worse than spending a night in this strange place. Jake tried to get a fire going, but the wood wouldn't catch, even with lighter fluid, something he'd brought reluctantly, preferring to start fires the traditional way. The flames would sputter and die within seconds. We'd pile tinder, arrange kindling in perfect teepee formations, apply match after match, and watch as the fire started enthusiastically before guttering out as if something was actively extinguishing it. "The wood's too wet," Jake said, but we both knew that wasn't true. The dead timber was bone dry, desiccated to the point where it should have burned like paper. Some of the smaller branches were so dry they crumbled to dust when we handled them. After an hour of frustration, we gave up and ate cold rations by the weak glow of our headlamps. The dehydrated beef stroganoff that had seemed like a clever lightweight meal choice back in the city now tasted like cardboard and disappointment. We ate in silence, both of us unwilling to voice the obvious fact that something was very wrong with this place. "Maybe the elevation's affecting our equipment," Jake suggested as we settled into our sleeping bags. "GPS can get wonky at certain altitudes, especially near large geological features." "What's our elevation?" He checked his altimeter, another piece of gear he'd insisted was essential. The display flickered between readings, sometimes showing 800 feet, sometimes 3,200, sometimes error messages in languages neither of us recognized. "Equipment failure," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to sounds that didn't belong in any forest I knew. Whispers in a language I couldn't identify, with consonants that seemed to require more tongue positions than human mouth should have. Footsteps circling our camp, not the heavy tread of large animals, but something lighter, more deliberate, like someone trying very hard to walk quietly and failing. Once, I swear I heard a child crying somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp. A high, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I mentioned it to Jake, he just stared at me with an expression I couldn't read in the dim glow of our battery-powered lantern. "There are no children out here, Mike," he said quietly. "No one else for miles." The way he said it made me wonder if he'd heard it too. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake every time a branch creaked or the wind shifted through the dead trees. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound like fabric tearing, slow, deliberate, like someone carefully opening a zipper. My sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, though I had no memory of opening it. The cold had seeped into my bones, and my breath crystallized in the air despite the October temperature that should have been mild. Jake was sitting upright in his bag, perfectly motionless, staring into the darkness between the trees. His headlamp was off, and in the faint starlight filtering through the dead branches, his face looked gray, almost corpse-like. "Did you hear that?" he whispered without looking at me. "Hear what?" "Someone calling my name." I listened, straining my ears against the oppressive silence. The normal sounds of a forest at night, owls, rustling leaves, distant water, were completely absent. It was as if we were camping in a vacuum. "Jake, there's no one. Listen." And then I heard it too. A voice, distant but clear, calling, "Jake, Jake, from somewhere deep in the forest. It sounded like a woman's voice, desperate and pleading, with an accent I couldn't place. The voice seemed to echo off the dead trees, bouncing around the clearing in ways that made it impossible to determine its direction. Jake started to get up, his movements mechanical, like he was sleepwalking. I grabbed his arm, feeling how cold his skin had become. "Don't. Whatever that is, it's not human." "How do you know?" I couldn't explain it, but something primal in my brain was screaming danger. The voice was wrong. Too melodic, too perfect, like someone trying very hard to sound human and failing in some fundamental way. It reminded me of those early computer-generated voices, technically correct but missing some essential quality that would make them believable. "Please," the voice called again, closer now. "Help me. I'm lost. I've been walking for so long." Jake's eyes had taken on a glassy quality, like he was looking at something I couldn't see. "She needs help, Mike. We can't just—" "No." I tightened my grip on his arm, feeling how thin he'd become. When had Jake gotten so thin? "We stay here until daylight." "But she's hurt," Jake said, and his voice sounded different, dreamy, disconnected. I can hear it in her voice. She's been out here alone, and she's scared. The voice continued calling, sometimes claiming to be a lost hiker, sometimes begging for water, for food, for someone to guide her back to the trail. But it was always Jake's name it called, never mine, as if it knew exactly who it wanted. "Jake, please," the voice pleaded, and now it sounded closer, almost at the edge of our clearing. "I can see your light. I just need help getting back to the trail. I have children waiting for me." Jake stood up, despite my grip on his arm. He was stronger than me, always had been, and when he decided to move, I couldn't stop him. "Stay here," he said, grabbing his headlamp. "I'll be right back." "Jake, don't—" But he was already walking toward the trees, his light beam cutting through the darkness. I watched him disappear into the dead forest, following that voice that called his name with increasing urgency. "I'm coming," Jake called out. "Keep talking so I can find you." That was the last time I heard his real voice. I sat there in the darkness, listening to Jake's voice grow more distant as he moved deeper into the forest. The woman's voice had stopped calling as soon as he started following it, which should have been our first clue that something was wrong. But I was too frightened to think clearly, too overwhelmed by the wrongness of this place to process what was happening. Hours passed. I called Jake's name until my voice gave out, but there was no response. As dawn finally broke, gray and cold through the dead branches, I faced the terrible realization that my best friend was gone. I spent the entire day searching, following boot prints that appeared and disappeared at random, calling his name until my throat was raw. The dead forest seemed to shift around me as I walked, paths opening and closing, landmarks rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. I found his headlamp hanging from a branch 8 feet off the ground, though I had no idea how it could have gotten there. His water bottle was sitting on a rock in a clearing I was certain I'd never seen before, still half full, but no Jake. As night fell, I faced the choice of continuing to search in the darkness or making camp and hoping he'd find his way back. The thought of spending another night in this place made my skin crawl, but the alternative, wandering through that maze of dead trees in the dark, seemed worse. I chose to wait. That was my first mistake. I set up my tent in the same clearing, managed to get a fire going that burned normally for the first time since we'd arrived. For a few hours, I felt almost human again. The flames pushed back the oppressive darkness, and I began to convince myself that Jake had simply gotten turned around, that he'd show up any minute with that sheepish grin and an apology for worrying me. I was heating water for instant coffee, trying to ignore the way the shadows danced at the edge of my vision, when I heard footsteps approaching through the trees. "Mike!" Jake's voice called out. "Mike, are you there?" Relief flooded through me like a physical thing. "Jake! Jesus! I've been looking for you all day. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said and stepped into the firelight. Except he wasn't fine. Not at all. The thing that walked into my camp looked like Jake, but it was wrong in ways that made my hindbrain scream warnings I didn't want to acknowledge. Jake's skin had taken on a waxy, pale quality, like candle wax that had been heated and cooled repeatedly. His eyes reflected the firelight with an unnatural shine, like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. When he smiled, I could see that his teeth had grown longer, sharper, and his gums had receded to give him a skeletal grin. But worst of all was the way he moved. Too fluid, like his joints had been replaced with something that bent in directions human joints shouldn't. He walked with a gliding motion that never quite touched the ground properly, and his head tilted at angles that made my stomach churn. "I found the most amazing place," he said, sitting down across the fire from me. His voice was Jake's voice, but the cadence was wrong, the inflection slightly off, like someone doing an impression from memory. "You have to come see it, Mike. It's beautiful." "Where were you?" I managed to ask, fighting the urge to run screaming into the forest. "I looked everywhere." "I was following the voice," he said, and his head tilted at an angle that made my vertebrae ache in sympathy. "She showed me things, Mike. Wonderful things. The truth about this place, about what's really out here in the dark. And now I want to show them to you." "What voice?" "The one calling my name. You heard it too, didn't you?" His smile widened, and I saw that his gums had receded even further, making his teeth look like fangs. "She's been waiting for us, Mike, for a very long time. She told me about the others who came before us, all the hikers who got lost and found their way to her instead." I knew with absolute certainty that this thing sitting across from me was not my friend. It looked like Jake, sounded like Jake, but something else was wearing his skin like a poorly fitted suit. "I'm tired," I said carefully, not wanting to provoke whatever this was. "Maybe we should get some sleep and head out in the morning." "Sleep?" The Jake thing agreed, but it didn't move. It just sat there, staring at me with those two bright eyes, smiling that horrible smile. "Yes, you should sleep, Mike. You'll need your strength for tomorrow, for what comes next." I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, knowing the thin nylon would provide exactly zero protection if that thing decided to come after me. Through the tent wall, I could see its silhouette sitting motionless by the fire. It didn't shift, didn't seem to breathe. It just sat there, watching my tent with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake every few minutes to check that the silhouette was still there. Around 3 a.m., I woke to find it gone. That's when I heard Jake's real voice, weak and terrified, calling from somewhere in the forest. "Mike, help me, please. It's still in my head." The voice was coming from the same direction the Jake thing had emerged from earlier, deeper in the dead forest. I grabbed my headlamp and the knife from my pack, a pathetic weapon but all I had, and crept out of my tent. The forest was absolutely silent. No wind, no insects, no night sounds at all. My headlamp beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted trunks and bare ground. I followed Jake's voice, which grew weaker as I got closer, punctuated by sounds that made my stomach clench. Soft whimpering, like someone in terrible pain. I found him in a depression between two massive, rotted logs, partially buried under a mound of decomposing leaves. His skin was gray, his lips blue with cold, but he was alive. Barely. "Mike," he whispered when he saw me, and I could see his real eyes looking back at me. Not the reflective things I'd seen by the fire, but Jake's actual brown eyes, filled with terror and pain. "Something's wrong with me. I can feel it, inside my head, moving around like it owns the place." "What happened? Where have you been?" "I followed the voice," he said, the same words the thing by the fire had used, but these carried the weight of genuine horror. "She led me to this place, and then something went inside me. It crawled in through my ears, Mike. I can feel it moving around, touching my memories, playing with them like they're toys. It wants to use me." I helped him sit up, checking for injuries. He seemed physically unharmed aside from the hypothermia and exhaustion, but there was something in his eyes, a terror so deep it made my soul ache just looking at it. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Right now." "It's still in me," Jake whispered, tears streaming down his gray cheeks. "I can feel it watching through my eyes, listening through my ears. It knows you're here, Mike. It knows you came to find me, and it's so happy about that. It's been hungry for so long. Jake, we need to—" Jake's head snapped up with a sickening crack, vertebrae popping like bubble wrap. When he looked at me again, those two bright eyes had returned, and the skeletal smile stretched his face in ways that didn't look anatomically possible. "Hello, Mike," it said in Jake's voice, but now I could hear other voices underneath, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking in unison. "Thank you for coming to get me. I was hoping you would." I ran. I crashed through the forest in blind panic, branches tearing at my face and clothes, roots sending me sprawling every few steps. Behind me, I could hear the Jake thing giving chase, but its movement was wrong. Too fast, too fluid, accompanied by sounds no human should make. Joints cracking, bones elongating, the wet sound of flesh reshaping itself. "Where are you going, Mike?" it called, and its voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the forest itself was speaking. "Don't you want to see the beautiful place I found? Don't you want to meet her? She's been so patient, waiting in the dark all these years. She has such wonderful things to show you." I fell down a steep embankment, my headlamp flying off and shattering against a rock. In the absolute darkness, I pressed myself against the muddy slope and tried to control my breathing. The thing was close. I could hear it moving through the trees above me, searching. "Mike!" Jake's real voice again, weak and pleading. "Mike, please help me. It's getting stronger. I don't know how much longer I can fight it. It's showing me things, Mike. Terrible things. What it did to the others. What it's going to do to us." I wanted to help him. God knows I wanted to climb back up that slope and save my best friend. But I knew that was exactly what the thing wanted me to do. It was using Jake's voice, Jake's memories, Jake's love for me as bait. "I can see your thoughts," the thing said, and now its voice carried a note of hunger that made my skin crawl. "You're going to leave him, aren't you? You're going to abandon your best friend to save yourself. How does that feel, Mike? How does it feel to know that you're a coward?" "Shut up," I whispered. "He's still in here, you know, still aware. He can feel everything I do with his body. Every time I twist his joints the wrong way, every time I make his teeth grow longer, every time I reach inside his mind and rearrange his memories like furniture. He's screaming, Mike. He's been screaming for hours." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice continued. "And when I'm done with him, when there's nothing left but an empty shell wearing his face, I'm going to find you. I'm going to crawl inside your skin and wear you like a costume. And then we'll go back to the city together, and you'll introduce me to all your friends, all your family. Sarah's been wondering where Jake is, hasn't she? She'll be so happy to see him come home." I stayed hidden in that muddy depression until dawn, listening to the thing that had been my friend taunt me from the darkness above. As the first gray light filtered through the trees, the voice finally stopped. When I climbed back up the embankment, I found Jake's body lying at the base of a dead tree. His neck was twisted at an impossible angle, his limbs arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at, arms and legs bent in directions that defied anatomy, fingers interlaced in configurations that seemed to spell out words in a language I didn't recognize. His eyes were gone, not torn out, but simply absent, leaving empty sockets that seemed to watch me anyway. The flesh around the sockets was smooth, as if the eyes had never been there at all. There was a message carved into the tree trunk above him, letters gouged deep into the dead wood with what looked like fingernails. "He fought well. You're next." I ran all that day, crashing through underbrush, following the sun west, praying I'd find a trail, a road, another human being. My water ran out around noon. My food was back at the camp with everything else I'd abandoned. All I had were the clothes on my back and the knife in my pocket. The landscape continued to shift around me as I ran. I'd follow what looked like a game trail for hours, only to have it end abruptly at a cliff that shouldn't have been there. Streams flowed uphill. The sun seemed to move in the wrong direction, setting in the north instead of the west. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north in this place where normal rules didn't apply. It was near what I hoped was sunset when I finally stumbled onto a logging road. The transition was so abrupt it felt like stepping from one world into another. One moment I was fighting through tangles of dead trees and twisted undergrowth. The next I was standing on graded gravel under a normal sky. I collapsed to my knees on that road and wept with relief. A Park Service truck found me 3 hours later, wandering down the middle of the asphalt, probably looking like a wild man. The rangers were kind, professional. They gave me water, food, medical attention. Ranger Martinez wrapped me in a blanket and spoke in soothing tones while his partner called for backup. When I told them about Jake, they organized a search party immediately. Helicopters, K-9 units, dozens of volunteers combing the forest. They found our abandoned campsite, my gear scattered around the dead fire ring, even the depression where I'd found Jake the second time. They never found his body. According to the official report, Jake Henley went missing during a hiking trip in Olympic National Park. The search was called off after 2 weeks. I attended the memorial service, accepted condolences from his family, answered the same questions from police and park rangers over and over. No, I didn't know what happened to him. No, there hadn't been any signs of wildlife in the area. No, Jake wasn't the type to just wander off. Yes, I was sure we'd been following the established trail. I never mentioned the voice in the darkness, the thing that wore Jake's face, the message carved in the tree. Who would believe me? Hell, I barely believe it myself, except for the nightmares that won't stop and the fact that I can't look at my reflection without wondering if something else is looking back. The worst part? 3 weeks after the memorial service, I got a text message from Jake's phone. "Miss me yet, Mike? I'm learning so much about being human. The way your hearts beat when you're scared. The way your voices crack when you lie. The way your minds break when you see something impossible. Can't wait to see you again." I changed my number immediately, moved to a different city, started seeing a therapist who thinks I have survivor's guilt and PTSD. Dr. Reeves is probably right about the PTSD, but she's wrong about the rest. Jake isn't dead. Something is wearing him, learning from him, preparing to come back and finish what it started. Sometimes I catch glimpses of familiar faces in crowds, people who move just a little too fluidly, who smile just a little too wide, whose eyes reflect light in ways that don't seem quite right. Last week, I saw Sarah at a coffee shop downtown. She waved at me with Jake's characteristic gesture, smiled with Jake's lopsided grin. When she spoke, her voice had Jake's inflection. "Hi, Mike," she said. "Jake's been telling me so much about your camping trip. Maybe the 3 of us should go hiking sometime." I ran. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. I escaped something in the Olympic National Forest that should not exist, something that took my best friend and used him against me. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I know it's still out there, and I know it's still hungry. The therapist says I should write about my experience, that putting it down on paper will help me process the trauma and move forward with my life. She doesn't understand that there is no moving forward, no processing this particular trauma. There's only waiting. Waiting for the next text message. Waiting for Jake to show up at my door with that too wide smile. Waiting for the moment when I'll have to decide whether to run again or finally give that thing what it wants. I keep the knife sharp, but I know it won't help. You can't kill something that's already dead, something that exists in the spaces between what's real and what's possible. You can only hope that when it comes for you, it will be quick. The worst part is that I miss him. I miss my friend, the real Jake who loved the wilderness and believed it would help us find our true selves. He was right about that, in a way. I found my true self out there in those dark woods. I'm a coward who left his best friend to die, and something in the forest knows it. It's been 6 hours since I started writing this. The sun has set, and I can hear something scratching at my apartment door. Fingernails on wood, patient and persistent. "Mike?" Jake's voice calls from the hallway. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." The scratching stops. Footsteps move away from the door. I think it's learning to be patient, learning to wait for the right moment, learning to be human. God help us all. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote highlands of West Virginia, along what the locals call Hollow Ridge, a stretch of Appalachian wilderness that most people avoid, though they'll never tell you exactly why. I should have listened to the warnings. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip with my college roommates, Sarah Rodriguez and Amy Mitchell. We'd been planning it for months, desperate to escape our suffocating office jobs in Richmond and reconnect with nature and each other. Sarah had found the trail online, a supposedly hidden gem that promised pristine wilderness and complete solitude, the kind of place where you could hike for days without seeing another soul. She was right about that last part. We arrived at the trailhead on a gray Friday afternoon in the late October. The parking area was nothing more than a muddy turnout beside a rusted Forest Service sign so weathered I couldn't read the trail name. The air hung thick with the smell of decomposing leaves and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. "Jesus, it's like a horror movie set out here," Amy muttered, shouldering her pack. She was the practical one among us, a financial analyst who approached everything with methodical precision. Her auburn hair was already pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she'd checked her gear 3 times before we left the car. Sarah laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, it's atmospheric. This is exactly what we wanted. Real wilderness, away from all the Instagram hikers." She was the adventurous one, always pushing us toward the next thrill. Her dark eyes sparkled with excitement as she adjusted her pack straps, but I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. I tried to shake off my unease as we started down the trail. The path was narrow and poorly maintained, crisscrossed with fallen logs and choked with overgrown ferns. The forest pressed in close on both sides, creating a tunnel of twisted branches overhead that blocked out most of the afternoon light. "GPS is acting up," Amy announced after we'd been hiking for about an hour. She was staring at her phone with a frown. "It keeps showing us in different locations. Sometimes it says we're 5 miles northeast of where we started. Sometimes it shows us moving backward." I checked my own phone. No signal, and the GPS was equally confused, placing our location somewhere in the middle of a river that I couldn't see anywhere around us. "Mine's doing the same thing." "It's the mountains," Sarah said dismissively. "Dense forest, steep terrain. It screws with the satellites. We'll be fine as long as we stay on the trail." But 20 minutes later, we realized there was no trail. It had simply vanished, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. We stood in a small clearing, turning in circles, searching for any sign of the path we'd been following. Behind us, our footprints disappeared into a tangle of thorny undergrowth that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. "This is impossible," Amy said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Trails don't just disappear. We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere." "We didn't take any turns," I replied, though my own certainty was crumbling. The path was straight. We were following it exactly. Sarah pulled out her paper map. She was old school that way, never fully trusting technology. But as she unfolded it, her face went pale. The ink was running, bleeding together in watery smears that made the topographical lines look like veins. The paper felt damp and cold to the touch, though none of us remembered it getting wet. "What the hell?" She held it up to the fading light, and I could see her hands shaking now. The map was completely illegible, nothing but soggy pulp and illegible stains. The temperature was dropping fast. I could see my breath now, and the sweet, rotting smell was getting stronger. Somewhere in the distance, a sound echoed through the trees, like a child crying, high and plaintive and utterly wrong in this desolate place. "We need to find shelter," Amy said, her analytical mind kicking in. "Set up camp, get a fire going, Figure this out in the morning with fresh eyes. We found a relatively flat spot near what looked like it might have once been a trail, though it was overgrown with moss and strange pale mushrooms that glowed faintly in the growing darkness. As we set up our tents, I noticed something odd about the trees around our campsite. They were perfectly straight, arranged in an almost perfect circle, as if they'd been planted rather than grown naturally. Amy tried to start a fire, but something was wrong with the wood. Despite being dry to the touch, it wouldn't catch. When flames finally took hold, they burned with an eerie blue tint that cast strange shadows and provided no warmth. "This place is fucked," Sarah whispered, staring into the blue flames. "There's something seriously wrong here." The crying sound came again, closer this time. It circled our campsite, moving through the trees with impossible speed. Sometimes it sounded like a child, sometimes like a woman in agony, sometimes like something that had never been human at all. We huddled together around the cold blue fire, none of us willing to admit how terrified we were. I kept checking my watch, but the hands seemed to be moving backward. When I looked up at the sky, the stars were in all the wrong positions, forming constellations I'd never seen before. "I'm going to try to find some actual firewood," Sarah announced suddenly, standing up. "Maybe if we can get a real fire going, we can figure out what's happening." "Don't go alone," I said immediately, grabbing her arm. "We should stick together. I'll just be right at the edge of the clearing. You can see me the whole time." She pulled free gently. "We need warmth, Jen. This cold, it's not natural." She was right about that. The temperature had plummeted at least 30 degrees in the past hour, and our breath was coming out in thick white plumes despite the relatively mild October weather we'd had when we arrived. I watched Sarah disappear into the tree line, her flashlight beam bouncing erratically through the undergrowth. Amy was rummaging through her pack, muttering about emergency supplies and backup plans. The crying had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I called Sarah's name, but my voice seemed to die just a few feet from my mouth, swallowed by the unnatural quiet. "She should be back by now," Amy said, her calm facade finally cracking. "This is wrong. This is all wrong." We searched the perimeter of our camp, calling Sarah's name and sweeping our flashlights through the trees, but it was like she'd vanished into thin air. There were no footprints, no broken branches, no sign that she'd ever left our immediate area. I don't remember sleeping, but I must have at some point because I woke up to gray dawn light filtering through the canopy and Amy shaking my shoulder frantically. "Jen, wake up, look." I stumbled out of my tent, still groggy and disoriented. The blue fire had burned all night, still providing no heat. But that wasn't what Amy was staring at. Our packs were torn open, contents scattered across the ground. Food supplies that had been carefully sealed in waterproof containers were now rotting and covered in a black, oily substance that stank like death. My sleeping bag was slashed open from the inside, the down stuffing drifting in the cold morning air like snow. "What could have done this?" Amy whispered. But I was looking at something else. Footprints in the soft earth around our campsite. They were human-shaped but wrong somehow. The toes too long, the heel marks too deep. They circled our camp in a perfect spiral, getting closer and closer to where we'd slept. "Sarah?" I called out, though part of me already knew she wouldn't answer. "Sarah, if you can hear me, please come back." The response came from directly behind me, so close I could feel breath on my neck. "I'm right here." I spun around, and there she was. Sarah stood at the edge of our campsite, smiling. But everything about her was wrong. Her clothes were the same ones she'd worn the night before, but they looked like they'd been buried in the ground for weeks. Her hair hung in wet tangles around her face, and her skin had a grayish pallor that made her look corpse-like in the morning light. "Where were you?" Amy demanded, relief and anger warring in her voice. "We looked everywhere for you. We thought—" "I got lost," Sarah said, but her voice was flat, emotionless. "Found my way back." She was still smiling, but it was too wide, stretching her lips in a way that revealed too many teeth, and she wasn't blinking. I realized with growing horror that she hadn't blinked once since I'd turned around. "Sarah, are you okay?" I asked carefully. "You look sick." Her head tilted to one side at an impossible angle, like a bird studying prey. "I feel wonderful, better than I've ever felt." The smile widened further. "I met someone in the woods. They showed me things. Beautiful things." Amy was backing away slowly, her hand reaching for the knife on her belt. She could see it too. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't our friend anymore. "What kind of things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while I also edged backward. Sarah's black eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "They showed me how the forest feeds, how it's been hungry for so long." She took a step closer and I could smell the stench of decay rising from her clothes. "They want to meet you too." That's when Amy ran. She bolted toward the tree line without a word, crashing through the undergrowth like a spooked deer. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound with inhuman speed, and the smile never left her face. "She shouldn't run," Sarah said conversationally. "Running makes the hunt more fun." I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the wrongness of everything. The way Sarah moved without quite seeming to touch the ground. The way shadows seemed to bend around her. The way her voice echoed as if it was coming from multiple throats. "What happened to you out there?" I whispered. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been my real friend, trapped and screaming behind those black orbs. "Jen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Jen, you have to run. Don't let it." But then the thing wearing Sarah's face was back, and it was laughing. The sound was like breaking glass, like screaming children, like wind through dead leaves. "She's trying to be helpful," it said in Sarah's voice, "but she's not in charge anymore." I ran. I crashed through the forest blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and face, following Amy's trail of broken twigs and disturbed earth. Behind me, I could hear something giving chase, not quite running, more like flowing through the trees with liquid grace. And it was laughing the whole time, that horrible sound that echoed from every direction at once. I found Amy crouched behind a fallen log about a quarter-mile from our campsite, hyperventilating and clutching her knife with white knuckles. "It's not her," she gasped when she saw me. "That's not Sarah." "Jesus Christ, Jen, did you see her eyes? Did you see what was in her eyes?" "We have to get out of here," I said, grabbing her arm. "Whatever's happening, we can't help her. We have to go." But Amy was shaking her head frantically. "Which way? Which way is out? The trail's gone, the GPS doesn't work, the map is ruined. We're lost, Jen. We're completely lost." She was right. In our panic, we'd run deeper into the forest with no sense of direction. The trees all looked the same. Tall, dark, twisted things that seemed to lean in toward us with malevolent intent. The sky was gray and featureless, giving no indication of the sun's position. And somewhere behind us, that liquid laughter was getting closer. "The car," I said suddenly. "We parked near water. I remember hearing a stream when we got out. If we can find water, we can follow it downhill, back to civilization." We started moving again, trying to be quiet while also covering ground as quickly as possible. The forest felt different now, more alive somehow. I could swear the trees were moving when I wasn't looking directly at them, repositioning themselves to block our path or funnel us in specific directions. The crying started again, that same childlike wailing we'd heard the night before. But now it was coming from Amy. I looked over at her in confusion, but she was just walking beside me, her mouth closed, her face set in grim determination. The crying was definitely coming from her direction, though, as if there was a child trapped inside her chest, sobbing to get out. "Amy," I said slowly, "do you hear that?" She stopped walking and looked at me with genuine confusion. "Hear what?" The crying cut off abruptly, leaving only oppressive silence. "Nothing," I lied. "I thought I heard—" "Never mind." But I knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The thing that had taken Sarah, it wasn't done with us. It was playing games, testing us, breaking us down piece by piece. We walked for what felt like hours, though my watch had stopped working entirely. The gray sky never changed, never grew lighter or darker, trapped in an eternal twilight that made it impossible to judge the passage of time. My feet were blistering in my hiking boots, and hunger gnawed at my stomach, but I didn't dare suggest we stop. Eventually, we found the stream. It was little more than a trickle of black water winding between moss-covered rocks, but it was flowing downhill, and that gave us direction. We followed it through a landscape that grew increasingly alien, fungi glowing in impossible colors, trees with bark that pulsed like skin, flowers that turned to track our movement like eyes. "This isn't real," Amy muttered, her voice hollow. "This can't be real. People don't just walk into fairy tale forests. GPS satellites don't stop working. Friends don't get possessed by demons or whatever the fuck that thing was." I wanted to agree with her, to cling to the rational explanation. But the evidence of my senses was overwhelming. Whatever this place was, it operated by different rules than the world we knew. The stream led us to a clearing where an old cabin squatted between the trees like a diseased toadstool. It was obviously abandoned, the roof partially caved in and the windows dark as dead eyes. But it was shelter, and we were both exhausted. "We can rest here for a few minutes," I said. "Figure out our next move." Amy nodded gratefully, and we approached the cabin cautiously. The door hung open on rusted hinges, revealing an interior thick with dust and decay. Ancient furniture sat covered in moldering sheets, and animal bones littered the floor. But there was something else. Scratch marks on the walls, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by human fingernails. And messages carved into the wooden beams, desperate last words from other travelers who'd found this place. Day 12. The children won't stop crying. Sarah took Jenny to feed the trees. Don't trust the ones who come back. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read that last one. Amy was exploring the back of the cabin, oblivious to the warnings carved around us. Her shoulders were shaking, and I could hear her muttering under her breath. "Amy?" I called softly. "Amy, we should go. This place isn't safe." She turned around, and I saw that she was crying. Not the supernatural sobbing we'd heard in the forest, but real tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore, Jen," she sobbed. "I'm so scared. I just want to go home. I want to see my mom again. I want to sleep in my own bed and eat cereal and watch stupid TV shows and pretend none of this ever happened." I moved toward her, meaning to offer comfort, but she backed away. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't touch me. I can feel it inside my head, trying to get in. Like static on a radio, getting louder and louder. What if it takes me too? What if I become like Sarah?" "That won't happen," I said, though I had no basis for the promise. "We're going to get out of here. We're going to make it home." But even as I spoke the words, I could see something changing in Amy's eyes. A darkness creeping in at the edges, like spilled ink spreading through water. "Jen," she whispered, her voice small and frightened. "I think it's too late." The crying started again, but this time it was definitely coming from Amy's mouth, even though her lips weren't moving. The sound built in intensity, growing from a soft whimper to a full-throated wail that seemed to shake the cabin's rotting timbers. I backed toward the door, my hand fumbling for the knife on my belt. "Fight it, Amy. Whatever it is, fight it." "I can't," she moaned, doubling over as if in physical pain. "It's showing me things. Terrible things. It wants me to hurt you, Jen. It wants me to bring you to the hollow places where the roots drink blood." The crying cut off suddenly, and Amy straightened up with a horrible calm. When she looked at me again, her eyes were completely black, just like Sarah's had been. "Hello, Jennifer," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "We've been waiting for you." I ran from the cabin without looking back, plunging into the forest with no destination except away. Behind me, I could hear Amy, or the thing that had been Amy, following at a leisurely pace. It didn't need to hurry. It knew I had nowhere to go. The trees seemed to shift and change around me as I ran, creating new paths and blocking old ones. I stumbled through groves of bone-white birches that whispered my name in voices like dried leaves, past pools of stagnant water that reflected faces I didn't recognize, through clearings carpeted with flowers that screamed when I stepped on them. I don't know how long I ran. Time had no meaning in that place. But eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I collapsed against a tree trunk, gasping for breath, my legs shaking with fatigue. The forest was quiet now. No crying, no laughter, no pursuing footsteps. Just the oppressive silence that felt like a held breath. That's when I heard the singing. It was Sarah's voice, pure and beautiful, drifting through the trees like a half-remembered lullaby. She was singing Danny Boy, the same song she used to sing when we were drunk in college, sprawled across someone's dorm room floor after too many cheap beers. Oh, Danny Boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. Despite everything, despite the wrongness of her transformation, despite the terror of the past day, I felt tears streaming down my face. This was my friend. This was the girl who'd held my hair back when I was sick, who'd listened to me cry over failed relationships, who'd convinced me to take this trip in the first place because she thought I needed adventure in my life. The summer's gone, and all the flowers are dying. 'Tis you must go and I must bide. The singing was getting closer. I could see movement through the trees now, two figures walking hand in hand toward my hiding spot, Sarah and Amy, both smiling those two wide smiles, both moving with that strange liquid grace. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, or when the valley's hushed and white with snow. I knew I should run. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get up and flee. But I was transfixed by the beauty of the song, by the familiar warmth of Sarah's voice. It reminded me of everything good about our friendship, all the reasons I'd loved these women like sisters. 'Tis I'll be here in sunshine or in shadow. Oh, Danny Boy, I love you so. They were close enough now that I could see the details of their faces, the gray pallor of dead skin, the black veins visible beneath the surface, the way their clothes hung on them like burial shrouds. But Sarah's voice was still beautiful, still heartbreakingly familiar. "Come back to us, Jen," she called when the song ended. "We miss you. It's lonely out here in the dark. We found the way home," Amy added, her head tilted at that unnatural angle. "We found where we belong. You can belong here too." They were 20 feet away now, 10 feet, close enough that I could smell the rot and earth clinging to them like perfume. "All you have to do is stop running," Sarah said gently. "Let us show you what we've learned. Let us bring you to the beautiful places under the ground." 5 feet. I could see the things moving beneath their skin now. Worms or insects or something else entirely, creating patterns like living tattoos. Could see the way their fingers had grown too long, ending in points that might have been claws. "Please, Jen," Amy whispered, reaching out toward me. "Don't make us chase you anymore. It hurts when we have to hunt." That's when I saw it, a flicker of my real friend behind the darkness in Amy's eyes. Just for a second, but enough to break whatever spell the singing had cast over me. I bolted. This time I didn't try to run in any particular direction. I just ran, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs, driven by pure animal panic. The things that had been my friends gave chase, no longer bothering with human pretenses. They moved through the forest like wolves, swift and sure, their inhuman cries echoing off the trees. But I had one advantage. Desperation gives you strength you never knew you had. I pushed my body beyond its limits, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the protests of my legs. When branches blocked my path, I crashed through them. When roots tried to trip me, I somehow found my footing. And then, impossibly, I saw it, a break in the trees ahead. Sunlight. Real sunlight, golden and warm, not the gray twilight that had trapped me for what felt like days. I burst out of the forest and found myself standing on the shoulder of a paved road. An actual road, with yellow lines and reflective markers and the beautiful smell of hot asphalt. In the distance, I could see traffic, real cars driven by real people who lived in the real world. I turned back toward the tree line, expecting to see my pursuers emerging behind me. But there was nothing there except normal forest. Pine trees and oaks and maples showing their autumn colors. No glowing fungi, no impossible geometry, no sense of malevolent presence. It was as if the nightmare landscape I'd escaped from simply didn't exist. I flagged down the first car that came along, a pickup truck driven by an elderly man who took one look at my bedraggled appearance and insisted on driving me to the nearest hospital. The state police were called, search and rescue teams were organized, and for 3 days they combed the forest looking for Sarah and Amy. They never found them. The official report concluded that my friends had suffered accidents, probably falling into one of the area's many hidden ravines or underground cave systems. The fact that I'd been found alone and delirious, talking about possessed friends and supernatural forests, was attributed to trauma and exposure. I never tried to correct their assumptions. That was 6 months ago. I've moved across the country since then, changed jobs, started seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma recovery. On good days, I can almost convince myself that it was all a hallucination brought on by stress and altitude and bad water. But then I'll hear someone singing "Danny Boy" on the radio, or I'll catch a whiff of that sweet, rotting smell when I'm walking through a park, and I'll remember the truth. They're still out there. Sarah and Amy and all the others who've wandered into that place and never come back the same. Still singing their beautiful, terrible songs. Still hunting for new friends to bring home to the hollow places where the trees drink blood and the children cry forever in the dark. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can hear them calling my name, begging me to come back, promising me that this time I won't have to run. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Olympic National Forest in Washington State during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip in late October. I should have known something was wrong when Brandon insisted we go off trail. "Come on, Mike," he'd said, shouldering his oversized pack with that grin that had gotten us into trouble since middle school. "When's the last time we actually explored something? Really got lost in the wilderness?" Sarah Rodriguez, our third companion and the voice of reason since childhood, had rolled her dark eyes. "Getting lost isn't the goal, Brandon. The goal is coming back alive." But Brandon had this way of wearing you down with enthusiasm, and after 6 months of my soul-crushing desk job in Seattle, the idea of disappearing into the forest for a few days felt like salvation. The 3 of us had been planning this trip since spring, a chance to reconnect, to remember who we were before mortgages and career anxiety consumed our 20s. The Olympic Peninsula in autumn was breathtaking, all rust-colored ferns and towering Douglas firs draped in moss like ancient cathedrals. We'd driven out from Seattle early Friday morning, the Toyota loaded with enough gear for a week, even though we'd only planned for 3 days. Sarah had insisted on the extra supplies, her practical nature manifesting in redundant food stores and backup equipment. "Trust me," she'd said, checking her GPS unit for the 10th time. "In country like this, you can't have too much gear." The official campsite felt too civilized for Brandon's taste, too many RVs, too many families with screaming children. So when he spotted what looked like an old deer trail winding deeper into the forest, away from the designated camping areas, his eyes lit up with mischief. "Look at that," he said, pointing into the green shadows between the trees. "That's calling to us." Sarah frowned at her GPS. "The trail's not on any of the maps." "Exactly," Brandon said. "Adventure." I should have sided with Sarah. I should have insisted we stick to the marked trails, the established campsites. But something about the way the late afternoon light filtered through the canopy made the deeper forest look magical, inviting, and after months of fluorescent office lighting, I craved that green dimness like a drug. "Just for a mile or two," I said, already adjusting my pack straps. We'll find a good spot and set up camp before dark." Sarah's expression tightened, but she nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but we mark our way back. And if we can't find water in the next hour, we turn around." The deer trail was narrow but well-defined, winding between enormous cedar trunks and through carpets of sword ferns. The air smelled of moss and decay, rich and loamy. Our footsteps were muffled by decades of fallen needles, creating an unusual silence that felt both peaceful and unsettling. After 20 minutes of hiking, Sarah stopped and pulled out her GPS unit. She frowned, tapped the screen, then held it up toward the canopy. "That's weird," she muttered. "What?" I asked, grateful for the break. My pack was heavier than I'd remembered. "I'm not getting a signal, at all." She showed me the screen, just a gray void where the map should have been. "This thing worked fine at the trailhead." Brandon laughed. "So what? We're going deeper into the forest. Those satellites probably can't penetrate all these trees." "GPS doesn't work that way," Sarah said, but she put the device away and shouldered her pack again. We continued deeper. The trail seemed to wind without purpose, sometimes doubling back on itself, sometimes branching into multiple paths that rejoined 100 yards later. The forest grew denser, the canopy thicker, until the afternoon light became a distant green glow filtering through layers of branches and moss. After another hour, we found water, a small creek burbling between moss-covered rocks. The sound was cheerful, almost musical, and I felt some of my unease dissipate. This was perfect, remote, beautiful, peaceful. "This'll do," Brandon announced, dropping his pack beside the creek with obvious relief. We set up camp in a small clearing beside the water, working efficiently in the fading light. Sarah and I had shared camping duties for years, moving around each other with practiced ease. She handled the tent while I gathered firewood. I filtered water while she organized our food supplies. Brandon, less experienced but enthusiastic, helped where he could and provided running commentary. "God, I forgot how quiet it is out here," he said as we sat around our small fire, eating camp stove pasta and watching sparks drift upward into the darkening sky. Listen to that silence. But it wasn't really silent. The creek murmured constantly, and somewhere in the distance an owl called. Branches creaked in the slight breeze. Small creatures rustled in the underbrush. The sounds of the forest at night, natural, comforting sounds that should have helped me relax. Instead, I found myself listening for something else, something between the familiar noises, a wrongness I couldn't define. "Anyone else think it's weird how that trail twisted around?" Sarah asked, staring into the fire. "I mean, deer don't usually make paths that elaborate." "Maybe it's an old Indian trail," Brandon suggested, "or logging road from way back." "Maybe." Sarah didn't sound convinced. She pulled out her topographic map and spread it across her knees, running her headlamp beam across the contour lines. "According to this, we should be right. Here." She pointed to a spot near the official trail, "but I don't see any creek marked." "Maps can be wrong," I said, though something cold was beginning to settle in my stomach. "These maps are updated annually," Sarah replied. "They don't miss entire waterways." Brandon stood up abruptly, startling me. "I'm going to get more firewood. This is barely enough to last an hour." "Don't go far," Sarah called after him, "and take a flashlight." His headlamp beam bobbed between the trees, growing fainter as he moved away from our circle of firelight. Sarah and I sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, listening to his footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. Then the footsteps stopped. "Brandon," Sarah called. No answer. We waited another minute, then Sarah cupped her hands around her mouth. "Brandon." Her voice echoed strangely among the trees, seeming to stretch and distort before fading into silence. No response. "He's probably just gathering wood," I said, but I was already reaching for my own flashlight. "Brandon!" we both shouted together. Nothing. Sarah was on her feet now, her face tight with worry. "How long has he been gone?" I checked my watch. Maybe 10 minutes? That's too long for gathering firewood. She grabbed her headlamp and started toward the trees. Brandon! I followed her, my light beam dancing across tree trunks and ferns. The forest seemed different now, more threatening. Shadows moved at the edge of our vision, and every sound made us freeze and listen. Brandon, this isn't funny. Sarah's voice was getting sharp with anxiety. We pushed deeper into the trees, calling his name, following what we thought was the direction he'd gone. But the forest all looked the same. Moss-covered trunks, drooping ferns, fallen logs. No sign of Brandon's passage. After 20 minutes of frantic searching, we returned to camp. The fire had burned down to coals while we were gone, casting everything in shifting red shadows. His pack is still here, Sarah said, kneeling beside Brandon's gear. His sleeping bag, his food, everything. Maybe he got turned around, I suggested weakly. Lost in the dark. With a headlamp? In 10 minutes? Sarah's voice was climbing toward panic. Mike, people don't just vanish. But people did vanish in places like this. I'd read the stories. Experienced hikers who stepped off marked trails and were never seen again, despite massive search efforts. The wilderness was vast and indifferent, and it didn't care about human plans or friendships. We should wait, I said. He'll come back. He's probably sitting by a tree somewhere, waiting for dawn, following basic wilderness safety. Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but she nodded reluctantly. We built up the fire again and sat close together, straining our ears for any sound that might indicate Brandon's return. The night stretched endlessly around us, full of small noises that made us jump. Sometime after midnight, I dozed off despite my anxiety. When I woke, gray dawn light was filtering through the canopy and Sarah was shaking my shoulder. Mike, look at this. She led me to the edge of our camp, where Brandon had disappeared the night before. In the soft earth beside the creek, clear as daylight, were his footprints leading away from camp. But they were wrong. The prints started normal, Brandon's size 11 hiking boots heading toward the trees. But after about 20 feet, they changed. The boot prints became something else entirely. Bare feet. Human feet, but wrong somehow. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. And these strange prints led directly back to our camp. What the hell? I whispered. Sarah was pale, her hands shaking as she pointed to the ground near our tent. Look. The bizarre footprints circled our campsite. Whatever had made them had walked around and around our tent while we slept, sometimes coming within inches of where our heads had been resting. The prints were deep and clear in the morning dew, impossible to mistake. This doesn't make sense, I said, my voice hoarse. Brandon doesn't... these aren't human, Sarah finished quietly. We broke camp in tense silence, stuffing our gear into packs with shaking hands. I kept expecting Brandon to come crashing through the trees, laughing at his successful prank, but the forest remained empty except for the two of us. Sarah tried her GPS again, still dead. The maps seemed useless. None of the landmarks matched what we could see around us. Even the creek wasn't marked on any topographic chart. We need to follow the trail back, Sarah said, shouldering her pack. Get to the car, call for help. But when we looked for the deer trail we'd followed the day before, we couldn't find it. The forest stretched in every direction, unmarked by any path we could recognize. Trees that had seemed familiar yesterday now looked alien and threatening. It was right here, I insisted, walking in circles around our former campsite. The trail was right here. I know, Sarah said, but her voice was hollow. I know it was. We picked a direction that felt right and started walking. The forest seemed to shift around us as we moved, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks changing when we weren't looking directly at them. My watch read 8:30 a.m., but the light filtering through the canopy felt wrong, too dim, too green, like late afternoon. After what felt like hours of hiking, we stopped to rest beside a fallen log. Sarah checked her watch and frowned. Mike, what time do you have? I looked at my watch. Still 8:30 a.m. The hands hadn't moved. That's not possible, I said, tapping the face. This is a digital watch. Sarah showed me hers, also stopped at 8:30. The LED display was frozen, as if time itself had gotten stuck in these woods. I don't like this, she whispered. None of this is normal. That's when we heard Brandon calling. Sarah, Mike, where are you guys? His voice came from deeper in the forest, distant but clear. Sarah and I looked at each other, relief and confusion warring in our expressions. Brandon, Sarah shouted back, we're here. Keep calling. I can't find the camp. His voice seemed to echo strangely, bouncing between the trees in ways that made it hard to pinpoint the direction. Everything looks the same. We followed the sound of his voice, pushing through undergrowth and around massive tree trunks. The calling continued, sometimes close, sometimes far away, always just out of sight. Brandon, stay where you are, I yelled. We're coming to you. But his voice kept moving, leading us deeper into the forest. After 20 minutes of futile pursuit, the calling stopped abruptly, leaving us alone in the green silence. Brandon, Sarah called, her voice cracking with exhaustion. No answer. We stood there for several minutes, breathing hard, listening for any sound. The forest around us was utterly still. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, no wind in the branches. Even the ever-present sound of the creek had faded away. Where's the water? Sarah asked suddenly. I listened carefully. She was right. The creek sound was gone. But we'd been following it all morning, using it as a landmark to navigate. How could we have lost the creek? Sarah pulled out her compass and watched the needle spin wildly before settling on what should have been north. Then it swung to east, then south. The needle couldn't seem to decide which direction was which. The magnetic field must be getting interference, she said, but her voice was shaking. From what? She didn't answer. We kept walking, choosing directions at random now, hoping to stumble across something familiar. The light gradually faded, though our frozen watches still claimed it was 8:30 in the morning. The forest grew darker and more oppressive, the trees seeming to lean inward over our heads. It was almost full dark when we saw the orange glow flickering between the trees ahead of us. A campfire, Sarah gasped, breaking into a run. I followed, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. The orange light grew brighter as we approached, and I could smell wood smoke and something else, something like cooking meat. We burst into a small clearing and stopped short. It was our campsite. Exactly as we'd left it that morning, the ring of stones around the fire pit, the flat spot where our tent had been, even the same fallen log where we'd eaten dinner the night before. But we'd been hiking away from this place all day. We should have been miles away by now. And sitting beside the fire, calmly tending a spit of meat over the flames, was Brandon. Hey guys, he said without looking up. Where'd you go? I came back with firewood and you were gone. Sarah and I stood at the edge of the clearing, afraid to move closer. Something about the scene felt wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what. Brandon, Sarah said carefully, where have you been? You disappeared last night. Last night? He laughed, still not looking at us. The meat on the spit was dripping fat into the fire, making it hiss and pop. I just went to get wood. Took a little longer than expected, but I found some good dry stuff. You've been gone for almost 24 hours, I said. Now he did look up and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. His eyes were wrong. They were still Brandon's eyes, same brown color, same shape, but they were flat and empty, like painted glass. No recognition, no warmth, no humanity. Just hollow spaces where a person should have been looking out. Have I? He asked, tilting his head unnaturally to one side. Time moves differently here. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. Mike, she whispered. Brandon smiled then, and it was the worst thing I'd ever seen. His mouth stretched too wide, showing too many teeth, and the expression never touched those dead glass eyes. "I'm cooking dinner," he said conversationally. "Found some fresh meat wandering around the forest. You must be hungry after all that walking in circles." The smell from the spit was stronger now, and with sick certainty I realized what it was. Not deer, not rabbit, human flesh. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, backing away slowly. "Right now." But Brandon was already standing, moving with a fluid grace that was nothing like his usual clumsy enthusiasm. He stepped between us and the dark trees, still smiling that horrible stretched smile. "Leave?" he said. "But you just got here. We haven't even eaten yet." I grabbed Sarah's hand and we ran. We crashed through the undergrowth blindly, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Behind us, I could hear Brandon following, not running, just walking steadily, but somehow keeping pace with our panicked flight. "This way," Sarah gasped, pulling me toward what looked like a gap between two enormous cedar trees. We squeezed through the narrow space and found ourselves in another clearing, this one smaller and filled with strange shapes in the darkness. Sarah's headlamp beam swept across them, and I bit back a scream. Camping gear. Dozens of tents, backpacks, sleeping bags, all arranged in neat rows like a military camp. But the gear was old, weathered, some of it decades old by the look of it. And there were no people. "What is this place?" Sarah breathed. I knelt beside the nearest tent and unzipped the flap. Inside was a mummified corpse in a moldering sleeping bag, its face frozen in a silent scream. The name tag on the tent read, "Simpson Family Reunion, 1987. Sarah was checking other tents, her light revealing more bodies, more evidence of campers who had come into these woods and never left. Some of the gear was recent. A high-tech GPS unit that must have failed just like ours. Lightweight equipment that couldn't be more than a few years old. "Mike," Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Look at this." She was standing beside a familiar blue tent, one that matched Brandon's exactly. The name tag read, "B. Edwards, 2019. "But that's impossible," I said. "Brandon just bought that tent last month." Sarah unzipped the flap with trembling fingers. Inside was another mummified corpse, this one wearing Brandon's clothes, Brandon's boots, even Brandon's distinctive Seattle Mariners cap. "Then what's been following us?" Sarah asked. The answer came from directly behind us. "I have been following you." We spun around to find Brandon, or the thing wearing Brandon's face, standing at the edge of the clearing. In the harsh light of our headlamps, the wrongness was more obvious. Its movements were too fluid, too controlled. Its smile was a parody of human expression. "This forest is hungry," it said in Brandon's voice, but with an inflection that was entirely alien. "It has been hungry for a very long time, and I am its appetite." Sarah fumbled for something in her pack. Bear spray, maybe, or a knife. But the Brandon thing was already moving, crossing the distance between us in a single fluid leap that no human could have managed. It landed on Sarah with inhuman force, driving her to the ground. She screamed once before its hands, no longer quite human hands, closed around her throat. I grabbed a tent stake from the ground and swung it at the creature's head, but it barely seemed to notice the impact. Its attention was entirely focused on Sarah, whose struggles were growing weaker. "Stop!" I shouted, hitting it again and again. "Let her go!" The thing that had been Brandon turned to look at me, Sarah's limp form still clutched in its grasp. Its face was changing now, features shifting and flowing like wet clay. Sometimes it looked like Brandon, sometimes like one of the mummified corpses, sometimes like nothing human at all. "She will feed the forest," it said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "As you will, as I did, once upon a time." Sarah's eyes fluttered open, still alive, but barely. I saw her hand move weakly toward her belt, where she kept her survival knife. The creature saw it too and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Such small, futile gestures," it said, reaching out toward me with elongated fingers that ended in black claws. "The forest has been patient, but its patience is not infinite." That's when Sarah struck. Her knife went deep into the creature's side and it shrieked, a sound that was definitely not human, that made my ears ring and my vision blur. Dark fluid poured from the wound, but instead of blood, it looked like sap mixed with rotting leaves. The thing released Sarah and staggered backward, its form wavering like heat distortion. For a moment, I could see through it to the trees beyond, as if it was losing cohesion. "Run!" Sarah gasped, struggling to her feet. "Mike, run!" We ran. Behind us, the creature's shrieks echoed through the forest, rising to an inhuman pitch that made the trees themselves seem to recoil. But we didn't look back. We crashed through the undergrowth, following no path, guided only by pure terror and the desperate need to escape. The forest seemed to fight us every step of the way. Branches caught at our clothes, roots tripped us. The very ground seemed to shift beneath our feet. But somehow we kept moving, kept running, even as exhaustion burned in our lungs and legs. And then, impossibly, we saw light ahead. Not the green twilight of the deep forest, but actual sunlight, yellow and warm and completely, utterly normal. We burst out of the tree line and found ourselves standing on a paved road. An actual road, with painted lines and everything. In the distance, I could see the roof of the ranger station where we'd registered for our camping permit. Sarah collapsed to her knees on the asphalt, sobbing with relief. I stood there, swaying on my feet, hardly able to believe we'd made it out. A park ranger in a green uniform was walking toward us from the station, concern evident on his face. "Folks, are you okay?" he called. "You look like you've been through hell." "Our friend," Sarah gasped. "Our friend is still in there. Brandon Edwards. We need to call for help." The ranger's expression grew more concerned. "Ma'am, when did you last see your friend?" "Last night," I said. "He disappeared from our campsite, and then this morning we found... How could I explain? How could I tell this reasonable-looking man about the creature wearing our friend's face, about the clearing full of mummified corpses, about the forest that twisted time and space and fed on human flesh? "Sir," the ranger said gently, "I need you to look at me. When did you enter the forest?" "Friday morning," Sarah said. "3 days ago?" The ranger shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, today is Monday. You've been missing for 9 days." I stared at him, the words not making sense. "That's impossible. It was just one night." But the ranger was already on his radio, calling for medical assistance and search teams. As we stood there on the safe, normal asphalt, I realized that my digital watch was working again, showing 2:15 p.m. on a Monday afternoon in November. 9 days. We'd lost 9 days in those woods. The search teams never found Brandon. They searched for weeks, bringing in dogs and helicopters and ground-penetrating radar. They found the official campsite where we'd originally planned to stay, but no trace of the deer trail we'd followed or the clearing where we'd camped or the horrible collection of mummified bodies. The official report listed Brandon Edwards as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or wildlife encounter. The case remains open, but they stopped actively searching after a month. Sarah and I both spent time in therapy, trying to process what we'd experienced. The therapists talked about shared hallucinations brought on by stress and dehydration, about how the mind can create elaborate false memories to cope with trauma. Maybe they're right. Maybe we just got lost in the woods, and our brains invented the rest to explain away Brandon's disappearance and our missing time. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring at the scars on Sarah's throat, 4 parallel lines where something with claws grabbed her, and I remember the taste of the air in that place, thick with decay and wrongness. And sometimes when I'm driving past heavily wooded areas, I think I see a figure standing between the trees. Always at the edge of my vision, always just familiar enough to make my heart skip. It looks like Brandon, but it's not Brandon. Brandon Edwards died in those woods 9 days before we found his body in the tent. What came back was something else, something that had been waiting in the forest for a very long time, something that might still be waiting. I don't go camping anymore. Sarah moved to Arizona, as far from the Olympic Peninsula as she could get. We don't talk about what happened, but we stay in touch. We need to know that we're both still here, still human, still ourselves. Because sometimes I wonder if we really did escape that forest, or if we're still there, wandering in circles while something wearing our faces goes through the motions of our old lives. Sometimes I wonder if the thing I see in mirrors is really me. But the scars on Sarah's throat are real. The 9 missing days are real. And somewhere in the Olympic National Forest, Brandon Edwards is still out there, cooking meat over a campfire that burns with the wrong color flame. Still waiting for new campers to follow the deer trail that appears only when someone is hungry enough to see it. Still smiling that terrible, too wide smile. Still feeding the forest. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 26 years old. This happened in the Olympic National Forest in Washington State during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip with my girlfriend Sarah and our mutual friend Kevin. I should have known something was wrong when the GPS started glitching on the drive up Highway 101. The device kept insisting we were driving through the middle of Lake Crescent, even though the road was bone dry beneath our tires. Sarah laughed it off, spinning the dial on the radio to find something other than static. Kevin, sprawled in the back seat with his hiking boots already laced tight, just shrugged and said, "Technology always got weird in the deep woods." "My dad used to say the trees here are older than God," Kevin muttered, pressing his face to the window. "Maybe they don't like being watched by satellites." The 3 of us had been planning this trip for months. Sarah, with her methodical nature, had researched every trail, every campsite, every weather pattern for the past 5 years. Kevin brought his usual reckless enthusiasm and a backpack stuffed with enough beef jerky to feed a small army. I brought my camera and a growing sense of unease I couldn't quite shake. We parked at the Sol Duke trailhead just as the afternoon sun began filtering through the canopy in long, golden shafts. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, Douglas fir and western hemlock rising like cathedral pillars, their tops lost in shadow. The air smelled of moss and decay, rich and loamy, with an undertone of something else I couldn't identify, something metallic and sharp. "Jesus, it's quiet," Sarah whispered, shouldering her pack. Her voice seemed to get swallowed by the trees before it could properly echo. She was right. No birds, no insects, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just the soft crunch of our boots on the needle-strewn trail and the distant whisper of wind through branches too high to see. The first few miles passed without incident. We followed the Sol Duke River deeper into the forest. The trail winding through groves of moss-draped maples and over wooden bridges that spanned rushing creeks. Kevin kept up a steady stream of chatter about his new job, his latest climbing adventures, his plans to thru-hike the Pacific Crest Trail next summer. Sarah and I walked hand in hand when the trail allowed it, occasionally stopping so I could photograph a particularly dramatic shaft of light or the way shadows pooled in the hollows between massive root systems. But, as the hours wore on, I began to notice things. Small things. The trail markers didn't match Sarah's map. According to her carefully annotated guidebook, we should have passed a wooden bridge over Cascade Creek after 2 miles. We'd been hiking for nearly 4 hours and hadn't seen it. When I mentioned this, Sarah frowned and double-checked her compass reading. "We're definitely heading northeast," she said, tapping the compass face with her finger. "But these shadows—" She gestured at the forest around us. "The sun should be behind us, not ahead of us." Kevin laughed and grabbed the map from her hands. "Come on, you two. It's just trees. They all look the same. We're probably just moving faster than expected." But I could see the doubt in Sarah's eyes, the way she kept glancing at her watch and then up at the canopy, trying to catch a glimpse of the sun through the dense weave of branches. We pressed on. The trail began to climb more steeply, switching back and forth up the side of a ridge I couldn't remember from Sarah's careful route planning. My calves burned and my pack felt heavier with each step. Behind me, I could hear Kevin's breathing growing labored, though he'd never admit to being tired. "How much further to the campsite?" I called over my shoulder. "Should be just over this ridge," Sarah replied, but her voice carried an edge of uncertainty that made my stomach clench. We crested the hill just as the last light was fading from the sky. Below us lay a small clearing beside what might have been a creek, though the water was too dark to reflect what little starlight filtered through the trees. Someone had built a fire ring from blackened stones, and there was a clear space for tents, but something about the place felt wrong. The silence was too complete, too heavy. Even our footsteps seemed muffled as we descended into the clearing. "This isn't right," Sarah said, pulling out her map again. "This campsite isn't marked anywhere." "Who cares?" Kevin dropped his pack with a grunt. "It's perfect. Fire ring, water, level ground. What more do you want?" Sarah and I exchanged glances. What we wanted was to be where we were supposed to be, following a plan, staying on marked trails with established campsites, but the alternative was hiking in full darkness, and none of us had the energy for that. We set up camp in tense silence. Sarah and I shared a two-person tent on the east side of the clearing, while Kevin pitched his solo shelter near the fire ring. The darkness seemed to press in around us as we worked, thick and suffocating despite the open sky above the clearing. I tried to start a fire while Sarah and Kevin prepared dinner, but something was wrong with the wood. It should have been dry. We hadn't had rain in over a week, but every piece I touched felt slightly damp, almost oily. When I finally got the kindling to catch, the flames burned blue-white instead of orange, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the flickering light. "Weird fire," Kevin observed, settling down beside me with a steaming bowl of instant noodles. "Probably just mineral deposits in the wood." But his explanation didn't account for the smell. Instead of wood smoke, the fire gave off an odor like burnt hair mixed with something sweet and rotten. I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid gagging. Sarah ate in silence, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Every few minutes she'd cock her head as if listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. "What is it?" I asked finally. "Nothing," she said too quickly. "Just, don't you think it's weird how quiet it is? I mean, we're next to a creek. There should be frogs, insects, something." Kevin shrugged. "Maybe they don't like tourists." But I knew what Sarah meant. The silence wasn't natural. It felt expectant, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We turned in early, partly because we were exhausted and partly because none of us wanted to acknowledge how unsettling the clearing had become after dark. The fire burned down to coals that continued to glow that strange blue-white color, casting shifting patterns on the walls of our tents. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to Sarah's breathing, slow into the rhythms of sleep, but I couldn't follow her into unconsciousness. Every small sound, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant murmur of the creek, the settling of cooling earth, seemed amplified and somehow threatening. Twice I thought I heard footsteps circling our campsite, but when I unzipped the tent flap to look, there was nothing but darkness and the pale glow of dying coals. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, I heard Kevin's tent zipper being opened. Soft footsteps moved across the clearing, paused at the edge of the woods, then continued into the forest. I waited for him to return, but eventually exhaustion pulled me under. I woke to Sarah shaking my shoulder, her face pale in the gray pre-dawn light. "Michael, Kevin's gone." I crawled out of the tent and confirmed what I already knew. Kevin's shelter was empty, his sleeping bag unzipped from the inside and thrown back as if he'd left in a hurry. His hiking boots were missing, but his pack remained untouched beside the cold fire ring. "Maybe he just went to take a piss," I suggested, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. It had been hours since I'd heard him leave. Sarah was already dressed and pulling on her boots. "We need to find him." We called his name as we searched the immediate area around the campsite, but the forest swallowed our voices without even the courtesy of an echo. Sarah found what might have been tracks leading north into the woods, though they were so faint I wondered if we were seeing what we wanted to see rather than what was actually there. "Kevin!" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with strain. "Kevin, where are you?" Nothing, not even the sound of birds or insects to break the oppressive silence. We spent the morning searching, moving in expanding circles around the campsite. The forest seemed different in daylight, not less threatening, but threatening in a different way. The trees pressed closer together, their trunks twisted into shapes that reminded me of reaching arms or grasping fingers. Moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and more than once I found myself ducking to avoid what turned out to be shadows. Sarah was methodical in her searching, calling Kevin's name every few minutes and carefully noting our direction of travel. But I could see the panic building behind her calm facade, the way her hands shook when she checked her compass, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something to be following us. By noon, we'd found nothing. No more tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. Kevin had simply vanished into the forest as if the trees had opened up and swallowed him whole. "We should go back to the car," I said as we sat on a fallen log sharing a granola bar. "Get help. Call the Rangers." Sarah nodded, but she was staring back the way we'd come with a strange expression on her face. "What is it?" "Look," she said, pointing to a large Douglas fir about 30 yards away. "Do you see anything weird about that tree?" I squinted at it, trying to see whatever had caught her attention. It looked like any other tree. Massive trunk, bark furrowed and deeply grooved, branches disappearing into the canopy above. But as I stared, I began to notice something odd. The grooves in the bark seemed to form a pattern, almost like, "Jesus," I breathed. The bark patterns looked like a face. Not just any face, but Kevin's face, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide with terror. The resemblance was so uncanny that I felt my skin crawl. "It's just pareidolia," Sarah said, but her voice was shaky. "You know, seeing faces in random patterns, like clouds." But even as she said it, I could see she was as unsettled as I was. We sat in silence for several minutes, neither of us able to look away from the tree, until Sarah finally stood and shouldered her pack. "Come on," she said. "Let's get back to camp and pack up. We can be at the trailhead before dark if we hurry." The walk back to the clearing felt longer than it should have, as if the forest itself was stretching, adding extra distance between us and our destination. Several times, Sarah had to check her compass to make sure we were still heading in the right direction. The shadows seemed to shift when we weren't looking directly at them, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. We were nearly back to the campsite when we heard him. "Hey, hey, over here." Kevin's voice came from somewhere ahead of us, cheerful and familiar. Sarah broke into a run, calling his name, but something made me hang back. The voice had sounded wrong somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me. We found him sitting beside the cold fire ring, still in the same clothes he'd worn the day before, but somehow cleaner, as if the forest had laundered them during his absence. He grinned up at us as we approached, that same easy smile I'd known for 3 years. "Where the hell have you been?" Sarah demanded, but I could hear the relief in her voice overwhelming her anger. "Sorry," Kevin said, stretching his arms above his head. "Couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk. Must have gotten turned around. Took me forever to find my way back." "All night?" I asked. "You've been gone since before dawn." Kevin's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Has it been that long? Time really flies out here." Sarah was already moving toward him, ready to throw her arms around him in relief, but I grabbed her shoulder and held her back. Something was wrong. I couldn't say what, exactly, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to be careful. "Kevin," I said slowly, "what did you have for dinner last night?" He tilted his head, still smiling. "Dinner?" "Yeah. What did you eat?" "Oh." The smile flickered again. "The usual, you know." But I did know, and that wasn't the usual. Kevin was obsessive about his trail food, could tell you exactly what he'd packed for every meal and how many calories each item contained. He'd never given such a vague answer about food in his life. "Are you feeling okay?" Sarah asked, stepping closer despite my restraining hand. "You look different." And he did look different, though it was hard to pinpoint exactly how. His skin seemed paler, almost translucent in the filtered light. His eyes, which had always been a warm brown, now appeared almost black. And his smile, that easy, familiar grin, didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. "I feel great," Kevin said, standing up with a fluid motion that somehow seemed wrong, too smooth, like he was moving underwater. "Better than great. This place is amazing. We should stay longer." "Actually," I said, tightening my grip on Sarah's shoulder, "we were just about to pack up and head back." Kevin's head snapped toward me with startling speed, and for just a moment his expression shifted into something else, something hungry and predatory that made my blood freeze in my veins. Then the smile returned, bright and false. "But we just got here," he said. "Don't you want to explore a little more? There are so many interesting things to see in these woods." Sarah was staring at him with growing alarm. "Kevin, you're scaring me. What happened to you out there?" "Nothing happened to me," Kevin replied, but his voice had changed too, developed a strange echo as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "I'm exactly the same as I've always been." That was when I noticed his feet. Kevin was standing in the soft earth beside the fire ring, but he wasn't leaving any footprints. The ground beneath his boots remained undisturbed, as if he were floating just above the surface. "Sarah," I whispered, slowly backing away and pulling her with me. "We need to go. Now." But it was too late. Kevin, or whatever was wearing Kevin's face, had heard me. His head turned toward us with that same unnatural speed, and when he smiled this time, I could see that his teeth had changed. They were too sharp now, too numerous, filling his mouth like broken glass. "You can't leave," he said, and his voice was no longer Kevin's voice, but something else, something that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "You belong to the forest now, just like I do." Sarah screamed. Kevin moved toward us with impossible speed, covering the distance between us in what seemed like a single bound. But instead of Kevin's familiar face, I found myself staring at something else, something with too many eyes and skin that shifted and crawled like living shadow. I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran. Behind us, the thing that had been Kevin laughed, a sound like breaking branches and dying animals. But it didn't immediately pursue us. Instead, I heard it calling in Kevin's voice, sweet and reasonable. "Come back, guys. Don't be silly. I just want to show you something." We crashed through the underbrush, ignoring the trail entirely, heading in what I hoped was the direction of the parking area. Branches tore at our clothes and faces, and roots seemed to reach up from the ground to trip us. But we didn't slow down. "What was that thing?" Sarah gasped as we ran. "I don't know," I panted back. "But it's not Kevin." The forest around us seemed to be changing as we moved through it. Trees that had been standing moments before were now fallen across our path. The ground rose and fell in hills that hadn't existed on our way in. Most disturbing of all, I kept catching glimpses of Kevin through the trees. Sometimes ahead of us, sometimes to the side, always watching with that terrible smile. Sarah's compass spun wildly, the needle unable to find magnetic north. When she tried to check our map, the paper crumbled in her hands like ancient parchment. "This way," I said, pointing toward what I thought was downhill. If we could find the river, we could follow it back to the trail. But the river, when we found it, was flowing the wrong direction. And the water was black, so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Michael," Sarah whispered, pointing across the stream. Kevin stood on the opposite bank, still wearing that horrible smile. But he wasn't alone anymore. There were others with him, hikers in clothing from different decades, their faces slack and their eyes empty. A woman in a 1980s windbreaker. A man in what looked like 1960s camping gear. A teenage girl in modern hiking boots but clothes that belonged in a museum. "Join us," Kevin called across the water. "It's so peaceful here. No worries, no pain, no fear. Just the forest, forever and ever." The other figures nodded in unison, their movements perfectly synchronized. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Those are the missing hikers," she breathed. "The ones from the newspaper articles. They've been disappearing for decades." I remembered now. Sarah had mentioned them during her research, hikers who'd vanished without a trace in the Olympic National Forest, their bodies never found. The authorities had blamed animal attacks, falls, hypothermia, but they'd all just walked into the woods and never come out. "We have to get out of here," I said. But when we turned around, Kevin was behind us too, somehow having crossed the black water without making a sound. And he was no longer bothering to maintain his human appearance. The thing wearing my friend's face was tall and gaunt, with too many joints in its arms and legs. Its skin had the gray-green color of dead moss, and when it opened its mouth, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth that went back much too far. "Why do you keep running?" it asked in Kevin's voice. "Don't you want to be with your friend?" Sarah raised her hands defensively, backing toward the black water. "You're not Kevin. Kevin would never hurt us." The creature tilted its head with a sound like creaking wood. "But I am Kevin. I have all his memories, all his feelings for you. I know about the time he broke his arm falling off his bike when he was 8. I know about his fear of commitment, his secret crush on his high school English teacher, his guilt about not calling his mother enough." It was true. Everything the thing said was accurate, down to details I'd forgotten Kevin had ever shared with us. "I know that he loves you both," the creature continued, stepping closer. "And that's why he wants to share this gift with you. No more aging, no more pain, no more death, just existence, pure and eternal." "By turning us into things like you?" I spat. The creature's smile widened impossibly. "The forest is hungry, Michael. It's been hungry for a very long time, and those who feed it are rewarded with immortality." Sarah had backed up to the edge of the black water. I could see her weighing her options, the creature in front of us, the dark water behind her, the ring of empty-eyed hikers on the opposite bank. "Sarah, don't," I started to say, but she'd already made her choice. She dove into the black water and disappeared beneath the surface without a splash. The creature that had been Kevin made a sound of annoyance. That was foolish. The water doesn't lead anywhere pleasant. I waited for Sarah to surface, counting the seconds. 10, 20, 30. The black water remained perfectly still, as if she'd never entered it at all. "Sarah!" I screamed, but there was no response. "She's gone," the creature said with Kevin's voice but without any of Kevin's warmth. "Fed to the hungry things that live in the deep places, but you don't have to suffer the same fate. Join us willingly, and the transformation will be gentle." I looked at the ring of empty-eyed hikers, at the creature wearing my friend's face, at the black water that had swallowed the woman I loved. The forest pressed in around us, ancient and patient and utterly alien. "No," I said. I ran. This time the creature pursued me immediately. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, moving with inhuman speed and agility. But it wasn't trying to catch me, I realized. It was hurting me, driving me deeper into the forest, away from any hope of escape. The trees grew thicker as I ran, their trunks twisted into impossible spirals that hurt to look at. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy and unstable, as if I were running across the surface of a vast organism rather than solid earth. And everywhere I looked I saw faces in the bark, in the patterns of moss, in the shadows between the trees, the faces of all the hikers who had come before me, now part of the forest forever. I burst into a clearing and immediately recognized it as our campsite, though it had changed. Our tents were still there, but they were covered in moss and vines as if they'd been abandoned for years. The fire ring was full of bones, small bones that might have belonged to animals, and larger ones that definitely didn't. "Welcome home," Kevin's voice said behind me. I spun around to face the creature, but it was Kevin who stood at the edge of the clearing. Not the twisted thing I'd been running from, but my friend as he'd always been. Rumpled hiking clothes, easy smile, familiar brown eyes. "Kevin," I whispered. "Hey, buddy." He stepped toward me, and this time his feet left prints in the soft earth. "Sorry about all that weirdness. I don't know what got into me." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that my knees nearly buckled. "Jesus, Kevin," I thought. "Where's Sarah?" We have to find Sarah." Kevin's expression grew puzzled. "Sarah? Who's Sarah?" The relief curdled into horror. "Sarah, my girlfriend. Your friend. She was with us. Michael," Kevin said gently, "it's just been you and me on this trip. There's no one named Sarah." But I remembered. I remembered her laugh, her careful planning, the way she'd held my hand on the trail. I remembered her diving into the black water to escape the thing that had been wearing Kevin's face. "You're lying," I said, backing away from him. "She was here. She's real." Kevin's expression grew concerned. "Buddy, I think the stress is getting to you. You've been talking to yourself for hours, having whole conversations with someone who isn't there. I'm worried about you." "No. I wouldn't let the forest take my memories of her, too. Sarah was real. She had existed. I had loved her." "Prove it," I said. "Show me her tent. Show me her gear." Kevin gestured around the clearing. "Look around, Michael. Do you see a second tent? Do you see her pack?" I looked and my heart sank. There was only one tent in the clearing, a solo shelter that belonged to Kevin. Only 2 packs beside the fire ring, mine and Kevin's. No sign that a third person had ever been there. But I remembered setting up Sarah's tent. I remembered her sleeping beside me. I remembered. "The photos," I said suddenly, grabbing my camera from my pack. I took photos of her on the trail. I scrolled through the images, growing more frantic as I found shot after shot of the forest, of Kevin, of the trail itself. But no Sarah. In every photo where I remembered her being, there was just empty space. "Michael," Kevin said softly, "you need help. This isolation, this stress, it's making you see things that aren't there." I stared at the photos, my hands shaking. Had I imagined her? Had the stress of the forest, the strange atmosphere, the oppressive silence, driven me to create a companion who had never existed? "No," I said aloud. "She was real. She saved my life. She showed me what you really are." Kevin's expression shifted, and for just a moment, I saw something else looking out through his eyes. Something ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. "What I really am?" Kevin asked, and his voice had developed that strange echo again. "What do you think I am, Michael?" "You're not Kevin," I said, raising my camera and snapping a photo. "Kevin is dead. You're something else, something that feeds on people, that wears their faces." I looked at the camera's display, and my blood turned to ice. The photo showed the clearing, the fire ring, my own shadow, but no Kevin. Where my friend should have been standing, there was only empty air. "Interesting," the thing said with Kevin's voice. "You can see me, but the camera cannot. I wonder what that means." I ran again, clutching my camera like a talisman. Behind me, the creature laughed with Kevin's voice, but the sound echoed strangely, as if coming from multiple directions at once. The forest blurred past me as I ran. Trees and shadows and moss-covered stones that might have been more bones. I had no destination in mind except away, but the forest seemed determined to confound even that simple goal. Paths appeared and disappeared. Hills rose where valleys had been moments before, and always there was the sound of Kevin's laughter following me through the trees. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, and then I ran some more. I ran until the forest began to thin, and I could see actual sunlight filtering through the canopy. I ran until I burst out of the tree line and found myself standing beside a familiar car in a familiar parking lot. My car. Our car. The one we'd driven up Highway 101 what felt like a lifetime ago. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands, dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat and started the engine, not caring about Kevin or his gear or anything except getting away from this place. The GPS came to life as I pulled out of the parking lot, cheerfully announcing that it had found my location and asking for my destination. I programmed it for home and drove, checking my rearview mirror obsessively for any sign of pursuit. But there was nothing behind me except empty road and trees. I drove for 3 hours without stopping, until I reached Tacoma and cell phone coverage, and then I called 911. I told them about Kevin's disappearance, about getting separated on the trail, about him wandering off in the night and never coming back. I didn't mention the creature, or the black water, or Sarah, because I was no longer sure what had been real and what had been stress-induced hallucination. The search and rescue team found our campsite 2 days later, along with Kevin's gear, but they found no trace of Kevin himself and no sign that a third person had ever been there. According to their report, the soil around the campsite showed evidence of only 2 people. Sarah Rodriguez was never reported missing because, according to every official record, Sarah Rodriguez didn't exist. There was no one by that name in any database, no missing person report, no employment records. No one at work had ever heard of her. No one in our friend group remembered her. But I remembered. I remembered her laugh and her careful planning and the way she'd held my hand on the trail. I remembered her diving into black water to save herself from something wearing Kevin's face. I remembered loving her. The doctors said it was a stress reaction, a psychological break brought on by isolation and fear. They prescribed medication and therapy and assured me that false memories were more common than people realized, especially in traumatic situations. But they couldn't explain the photos I'd taken of her on previous trips, the ones saved to my computer at home. They couldn't explain the drawers full of her clothes in my apartment, or the toiletries in my bathroom that belonged to no one else. They couldn't explain why I still got calls on her phone, which sat in a drawer in my kitchen, silent and accusatory. The calls always came in the middle of the night, and when I answered, there was nothing but the sound of wind through trees, and sometimes, very faintly, Kevin's voice calling my name. I moved to Seattle 6 months later, got a new job, tried to start over. But the dreams never stopped. Every night I found myself back in that clearing watching Kevin emerge from the forest with his too wide smile and his impossible teeth. Every night I watched Sarah disappear into black water that reflected no light. And every night I woke up knowing that somewhere in the Olympic National Forest, they were both still there. Sarah, trapped in whatever hungry darkness lived beneath the surface of that impossible stream, and Kevin walking the trails with his empty smile, waiting for the next group of hikers to stumble into his domain. The forest is patient. It can wait. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I think about driving back to that trailhead. I think about walking into those woods one more time, about finding that clearing and settling down beside the fire ring full of bones. I think about joining them, about letting the forest have what it's been calling for all these months. But then I remember Sarah's final act, diving into those black waters rather than becoming part of whatever the forest wanted us to become. She chose the unknown horror rather than the certain one. She chose to keep fighting, even in the face of impossible odds. So I keep fighting too. I keep remembering her, keep insisting on her reality in the face of a world that says she never existed. I keep her phone charged and her clothes clean and her memory alive, because forgetting her would be the final victory for whatever lives in those woods. But sometimes when the wind is just right and the night is particularly dark, I can hear Kevin calling my name through the walls of my apartment. And I know that someday, when I'm weak or tired or just can't fight anymore, I'll answer. The forest is patient. It can wait. My name is David Jones, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, 3 miles past the last cell tower, where the old logging roads turn to deer paths and the darkness between the trees seems to breathe. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus suggested the trip. My best friend since college had been different lately, distant, hollow-eyed, speaking in half-sentences about getting back to something real. His girlfriend, Sarah, worried about him constantly, calling me at odd hours to ask if I'd noticed the changes too. The weight loss, the way he'd stare at nothing for minutes at a time, how he'd started collecting old maps of places that didn't exist anymore. He needs this, Sarah had pleaded over the phone 2 weeks before we left. He needs his best friend, and he needs to get away from everything. Please, David. I'm scared of what happens if we don't do something. So I agreed to 3 days in the High Peaks wilderness, though I'd never been much for camping. Marcus had chosen the spot, a remote lake called Tear of the Clouds, accessible only by a 7-mile hike through dense forest. He claimed his grandfather had told him stories about it, about how the old Haudenosaunee considered it sacred, a place where the veil between worlds grew thin. We started the hike on a Thursday morning in late October. The autumn colors had mostly fallen, leaving the trees skeletal and gray against an overcast sky. Marcus led the way with his new GPS unit, consulting it obsessively every few hundred yards. Sarah walked between us, her hiking boots crunching through the dead leaves, occasionally reaching out to touch Marcus's shoulder when he stopped to stare too long into the shadows between the pines. "The GPS keeps jumping," Marcus said after our first hour of walking. He held the device out to me, frowning. "Look at this. It says we've traveled 12 miles, but we can't have gone more than 3. I glanced at the screen. The blue dot representing our position flickered erratically, sometimes showing us deep in the forest, sometimes placing us in the middle of what appeared to be a lake. "Electronics get funny up here," I said, though I'd never seen a GPS malfunction quite like that. "Magnetic interference from the rocks." Marcus didn't look convinced. He kept checking the device, his movements becoming more agitated as the display continued to glitch. By noon, according to his map, we should have reached Tear of the Clouds. Instead, we found ourselves in a grove of ancient hemlocks, their trunks so massive that 3 people couldn't have wrapped their arms around them. "We're lost," Sarah said, setting down her pack. Her face was flushed from exertion, and I could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes. "Marcus, baby, we need to turn around." "We're not lost." Marcus's voice had taken on a sharp edge. "The lake is here. I can feel it." I looked around at the towering trees, their canopy so thick that even in daylight the grove felt submerged in twilight. There was no lake. There was no sign we were anywhere near water. But Marcus had already started walking again, pushing deeper into the hemlock grove, and something about the way he moved, too purposeful, too certain, made my skin crawl. We followed him for another hour before the trees suddenly opened onto the shore of a dark lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the gray sky like black glass. No wind rippled its surface. No insects buzzed above it. The silence was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. "Tear of the Clouds," Marcus said, and there was something wrong with his smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth. Sarah and I exchanged glances. I pulled out my own map and compass, but the needle spun wildly, never settling on magnetic north. According to my topographic map, there should be no lake in this area. We were supposed to be on a ridge, with the actual Tear of the Clouds still miles to the north. "This isn't right," I said. "Marcus, this lake isn't on any of the maps." "Maps lie," he said simply, and began setting up his tent on a small clearing near the water's edge. The afternoon passed in uncomfortable silence. I tried to help Marcus with his tent, but he brushed me away, insisting he needed to do it himself. His movements were strange, too fluid, too quick, like he was following some internal rhythm I couldn't hear. Sarah sat on a fallen log, watching him with growing alarm. "David," she whispered when Marcus walked down to the water to fill his canteen. "Something's wrong with him. He's been like this for weeks, but it's getting worse." "What do you mean?" "He doesn't sleep anymore. He just lies there with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. And yesterday, I found him in the basement, digging. He'd torn up the concrete floor with his bare hands, and when I asked him what he was doing, he said he was looking for the way down." Before I could respond, Marcus returned from the lake. His canteen was empty. "Water's not good," he said, though he hadn't tasted it. "Something died in it, long time ago." As evening approached, we tried to build a campfire. The wood was dry, the kindling caught easily, but no matter what we did, the flames burned blue-white instead of orange. The unnatural fire gave off no warmth, and in its cold light, Our shadows moved independently, dancing to a rhythm that had nothing to do with the flickering flames. "This is fucked up," Sarah said, backing away from the fire. "We need to leave, now." "Can't leave in the dark," Marcus said. He was sitting cross-legged beside the blue flames, staring into them with rapt attention. Things hunt in the dark. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "What things, Marcus?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring into the fire, and in its cold light, I could swear his eyes had no pupils, just whites, reflecting the blue flames like twin mirrors. We ate a cold dinner from our backpacks, none of us willing to cook over that otherworldly fire. As full darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, and Sarah and I retreated to our shared tent. Marcus remained outside, still sitting by the blue flames, motionless as a statue. "We have to get him help," Sarah whispered as we lay in our sleeping bags. "Professional help. When we get back to civilization, I'm calling his sister. She'll know what to do." I was about to respond when we heard the sound. It started low, barely audible. A humming that seemed to come from the lake itself. Gradually, it grew louder, resolving into something that might have been singing, if singing could sound like wind through a graveyard. Sarah gripped my arm. "What is that?" Through the thin nylon of our tent, I could see Marcus's silhouette still sitting by the fire. But there was something wrong with the shadow. It was too tall, too thin, and it moved when Marcus didn't. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of splashing from the lake. Heavy, deliberate splashes, like something large emerging from the water. Sarah and I lay frozen, listening to wet footsteps circling our camp. "Marcus," I called out softly. No answer. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was complete silence. Then I heard the zipper of Marcus's tent being opened, followed by the sound of him crawling inside. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Sarah. We lay pressed against each other, listening to the sounds from Marcus's tent, wet, sliding noises that had no business coming from where a human being should be sleeping. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, we emerged from our tent to find Marcus standing at the edge of the lake. He was perfectly dry, but there were wet footprints leading from the water to his tent and back again. "Morning," he said without turning around. His voice sounded different, hollowed out like an echo of itself. "Marcus, we need to talk," Sarah said, approaching him cautiously. "You're scaring us." He turned then, and I saw that his eyes were bloodshot, the pupils dilated to pinpricks. There were scratches on his neck that hadn't been there the day before. Long, deep gouges that should have been bleeding, but weren't. "I'm fine," he said, but the words came out wrong, like he was speaking a foreign language and translating each word individually. "Better than fine. I understand now." Understand what?" "Why we came here. Why we had to come here." He gestured toward the lake. "It's been waiting. Such a long time. Waiting." Sarah started crying then, quiet tears that she tried to hide by turning away. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't take my eyes off Marcus. There was something about the way he stood, the way he held his head at that slight angle. It looked like Marcus, but it felt fundamentally wrong, like a photograph that was almost but not quite in focus. "We're leaving," I said firmly. "Pack up your gear, we're hiking out now." Marcus smiled, and I saw that his teeth were stained black. "Can't leave, David. Not yet. Haven't learned what we came to learn." "We didn't come to learn anything. We came camping, and now we're going home." "Home," Marcus repeated as if testing the word. "Yes, home. But first—" He walked past us toward the forest. At the tree line, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "I need to show you something. Both of you. Something important." Against every instinct I had, we followed him. Sarah clutched my hand as Marcus led us deeper into the woods, following no path I could see. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the morning light. The further we walked, the more the forest changed around us. The hemlocks gave way to species I didn't recognize, twisted things with bark like scales and leaves that moved without any wind. We walked for what felt like hours, though my watch had stopped working sometime during the night. Marcus never hesitated, never checked his compass or GPS. He moved through the alien forest like he'd walked this route 1,000 times before. Finally, we emerged into a clearing dominated by an enormous oak tree. Its trunk was easily 20 feet in diameter, and its gnarled branches reached up into the gray sky like arthritic fingers. But it was what hung from those branches that made Sarah scream. Bodies. Dozens of them, suspended by ropes that looked far too new for how long the corpses had been hanging there. Some were recent enough that I could still make out faces. Hikers, judging by their clothes. Others had been there so long they were little more than bones and tatters of fabric. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Marcus said, his voice filled with genuine wonder. "They've been collecting for centuries, building the family." I grabbed Sarah's hand and started backing away, but Marcus moved faster than any human should be able to move. One moment he was standing by the tree, the next he was blocking our path back to the forest. "You can't leave," he said, and his voice had changed completely. It was deeper now, resonant, like multiple people speaking in unison. "We need you. Need what you carry." "Marcus, please," Sarah sobbed. "It's me. It's Sarah. I love you." The thing wearing Marcus's face tilted its head, considering her words. "Marcus," it said slowly. "Yes, he loved you too. Such a strong emotion. So nourishing." It reached out with Marcus's hand and touched Sarah's cheek. Where its fingers made contact, her skin began to blacken and peel. I yanked her away and ran. Behind us, the thing that had been Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the cries of dying animals. I could hear it crashing through the forest after us, moving through the trees with inhuman speed and agility. We ran blindly, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Sarah stumbled and fell, and I hauled her back to her feet, my heart hammering against my ribs. The laughter followed us, sometimes close enough that I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, sometimes fading into the distance only to return from a completely different direction. I don't know how long we ran. Time had become meaningless in that place. But eventually, we burst out of the tree line and found ourselves back at the dark lake. Our camp was exactly as we'd left it, the blue fire still burning cold and bright. "The packs," I gasped. "We need our gear." We ran to our tent and started stuffing our sleeping bags and supplies into our backpacks. I was shoving my spare clothes into my pack when I heard Sarah scream. I spun around to see Marcus, or the thing that looked like Marcus, standing at the entrance to our tent. But now the disguise was slipping. His skin was too pale, almost translucent, and I could see dark veins pulsing beneath it. His eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all. "Leaving so soon?" it asked in that harmonic voice. "But we haven't finished our conversation." "Stay away from us," I said, grabbing the camp knife from my pack. The thing laughed again. "Oh, David. Sweet, loyal David. Do you really think you can hurt me with that little blade?" It stepped into the tent, and I saw that its feet weren't quite touching the ground. It floated toward us, and with each movement, its human disguise slipped a little more. The skin began to split and peel, revealing something wet and glistening underneath. I lunged forward with the knife, aiming for its chest. The blade passed through the thing's body like it was made of smoke, and suddenly I was on the ground, pain exploding through my skull where something had struck me. "David!" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. I looked up to see the thing holding her by the throat, lifting her off the ground. Her feet kicked helplessly as she struggled to breathe. "Such strong emotions," it said, studying her face with scientific interest. "Fear, love, desperation. I can taste them all." Sarah's eyes began to change, the brown slowly leaching out until they were the same lightless black as the creature's. Her struggles became weaker, then stopped altogether. "Sarah," I whispered. She turned to look at me, and when she smiled, it was with the same too-wide grin I'd seen on Marcus's face. "Hello, David," she said in that harmonic voice. "Isn't this wonderful? We're all together now." I scrambled backward, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the knife. Both of them stood there, watching me with those black eyes, their heads tilted at identical angles. "Your turn," the Marcus thing said. "No," I managed to say. "No, I won't let you." I staggered to my feet and ran for the lake. Behind me, I could hear them laughing in perfect unison. At the water's edge, I paused, looking back at the campsite where two things wearing the faces of my best friend and his girlfriend stood waiting. The water was ice cold when I dove in. I swam as hard as I could toward the center of the lake, my clothes dragging me down. The water was deeper than it had any right to be. I swam down and down without ever touching bottom, my lungs burning for air. When I finally surfaced, gasping and choking, I was alone. The shore was empty. The blue fire had gone out and our tents had vanished. It was as if our campsite had never existed. I swam to shore and crawled onto the rocky beach, shivering violently. The forest around the lake was different now. Normal pine and birch trees instead of the alien species we'd walked through earlier. When I checked my compass, the needle pointed steadily north. It took me 6 hours to hike out of the wilderness. I followed game trails and old logging roads, navigating by compass and the position of the sun. When I finally reached my car, I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the keys in my trembling hands. The police didn't believe my story, of course. According to their investigation, Marcus and Sarah had never accompanied me into the wilderness. Their names weren't on the camping permit I'd filed. There was no record of them at the sporting goods store where I claimed we'd bought supplies together. Security footage from the trailhead showed only me entering the forest alone. "Isolation can play tricks on the mind," the state trooper told me kindly. "You've been under a lot of stress lately. People see things, hear things. It's more common than you might think. But I know what I experienced. I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls. No one speaks, but I can hear breathing on the other end of the line. The kind of breathing that sounds like it's coming from 2 sets of lungs. Last week, I found a photograph slipped under my apartment door. It showed a campsite by a dark lake, with a blue fire burning in the center. 2 figures stood beside the fire, too distant to make out clearly, but I recognized their postures. One was tall and lean like Marcus. The other was shorter, with Sarah's distinctive way of holding her shoulders. They were both waving at the camera. The photograph was taken from inside my apartment, looking out through my living room window. But I live on the 14th floor of a downtown high-rise. There's nothing outside my window but empty air and a 200-foot drop to the street below. I've been thinking about moving. Somewhere far away, maybe out of state. But I'm starting to suspect it won't matter where I go. Some things, once they've found you, never stop looking, and some places, once you've been there, never really let you leave. Yesterday, I found a new map slipped under my door. It shows a lake that doesn't exist on any official survey, surrounded by forests that cartographers have never documented. There's a red X marked beside the lake and a note written in handwriting I recognize as my own, though I never wrote it. "Come back soon. We miss you." The strangest part is that I'm starting to miss them too. Marcus and Sarah, or the things that wear their faces. They were my best friends after all. We shared something together in that place beyond the trees, something more intimate than fear or love or death. I find myself driving north on weekends, following back roads toward the mountains. I never make it all the way there. Something always stops me, some last vestige of sanity that turns my car around and sends me home. But each time I drive a little farther. Each time the pull gets a little stronger. I'm writing this account as a kind of insurance policy, something to leave behind in case I don't come back from my next drive north. If you're reading this, it probably means I finally found my way back to that lake where time moves differently, and the water reflects more than just the sky. Don't look for me. Don't try to follow the map if you find it. Some places are hungry, and they never stop feeding. Some friendships transcend death, and some reunions are worth any price. But if you ever find yourself camping in the Adirondacks, and you come across a lake that isn't on any map, a lake where the fire burns blue and the water is too still, turn around. Walk away. Don't look back, because they'll be waiting for you too, wearing faces you recognize, speaking with voices you trust, and they'll tell you that you've finally come home. My name is David Jones, and I am 34 years old. By the time you read this, I probably won't be anymore. Not in any way that matters. But I'll be waiting by the lake with my friends if you ever want to visit. We're always looking for new family members. Final word count, 7,184. My name is James Anderson, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Cascade Range of Washington State, deep in the old-growth forest where the Douglas firs grow so thick they swallow daylight whole, even at noon. Sarah and I had been together for 3 years, and the cracks were starting to show. Not the dramatic kind that explode into screaming matches, but the quiet erosion that happens when two people slowly realize they might be strangers sharing a bed. The camping trip was my idea, a last-ditch effort to find whatever we'd lost somewhere along the way. 3 days in the wilderness, no cell service, no distractions. Just us and the ancient silence of the mountains. Sarah Rodriguez was 27, with dark hair that caught sunlight like spilled ink and a laugh that used to make my chest tight with happiness. She'd been distant for months, working late, coming home exhausted and hollow-eyed. When I suggested the trip, she'd agreed with the weary resignation of someone checking off a box on a relationship to-do list. We drove Highway 20 until the pavement gave way to gravel, then gravel to dirt, following increasingly faded Forest Service signs deeper into the Olympic National Forest. Our destination was Lake Serene, a glacial tarn nestled in a cirque below Caleton Peak. The GPS died first, not the battery, but the signal itself, the little blue dot simply vanishing as if we'd driven off the edge of the digital world. "That's weird," Sarah said, tapping the screen. "It was working fine a minute ago." I checked my phone. No bars. We're pretty deep in. These mountains play hell with signals. But something about the sudden, complete cutoff felt wrong. Electronics don't usually fail so cleanly. So, absolutely. The trail started at a gravel parking area littered with broken glass and rusted beer cans. A wooden sign, weathered nearly blank, pointed toward Lake Serene, 3.2 miles. The forest closed around us immediately, a green cathedral of moss-draped giants that muffled sound and filtered light into an underwater dimness. Sarah walked ahead of me, her red backpack a bright spot in the gloom. We'd hardly spoken during the 2-hour drive, and the silence felt heavier now, pressed down by the weight of ancient wood. Every footstep seemed too loud, every snapped twig an intrusion into something that preferred to be left undisturbed. The trail climbed steadily through switchbacks carved into steep hillsides. Nurse logs lay across the path like fallen columns, their decomposing bodies nurturing gardens of ferns and seedlings. The air smelled of wet earth and decay, that rich forest funk that speaks of things constantly dying and being reborn. "Remember when we hiked Mount Washington?" Sarah said suddenly, breaking an hour of silence. "You made me carry half your gear because you forgot to check the weight distribution." I smiled, remembering. "And you bitched about it for 3 days." "I did not bitch. I provided constructive feedback on your planning skills." For the first time in weeks, she sounded like the Sarah I'd fallen in love with. Maybe this trip would work after all. The forest grew stranger as we climbed. Trees twisted in unnatural spirals, their bark scored with deep gouges that looked almost like claw marks. I told myself it was probably from bears sharpening their claws, but the scratches went too high, cut too deep. Some reached 15 feet up the trunks. We reached Lake Serene, just as the sun touched the tree line. The water lay black and still, perfectly reflecting the granite walls that rose on three sides like the interior of a vast stone bowl. Our campsite was a small clearing on the western shore, marked by a fire ring of blackened stones and the remains of previous visitors. Tent stakes forgotten in the earth, scraps of aluminum foil scattered in the underbrush. Setting up camp felt reassuringly normal. Sarah had always been good with the tent, her engineer's mind naturally grasping the geometry of poles and stakes. I gathered firewood while she worked, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching us from the tree line. The feeling persisted as darkness fell. The forest didn't quiet down the way it should. Instead, it seemed to hold its breath. No owl calls, no rustle of small animals, just an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional splash from the lake's dark surface. "What was that?" Sarah asked as we sat by our small fire heating canned soup on my camp stove. "What was what?" "That splash. Something big." I listened but heard only the fire's soft crackling. Probably just a beaver, or a fish jumping. But the splashes came again, irregular and too large for fish. Something was moving in the water, disturbing the perfect mirror of stars reflected on the surface. I thought I saw a dark shape break the surface near the far shore, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. Sarah moved closer to me, and I felt some of the old warmth between us kindle. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire dance and listening to the night sounds that weren't quite right. "James," she said softly, "I'm sorry about these past few months. I know I've been distant," I finished. "Yeah, work's been insane, and I've been thinking about us, about where we're going." She leaned against my shoulder. "I don't want to lose what we have." I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with wood smoke. "We won't. We'll figure it out." The fire burned low, and we retreated to our tent as the temperature dropped. The sleeping bags we'd zipped together felt warm and safe, a small island of humanity in the vast indifference of the wilderness. Sarah fell asleep quickly, her breathing deep and regular against my chest. I lay awake longer, listening. The silence was profound now, so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. No wind, no insect sounds, nothing. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small sounds your body makes simply by existing. Sometime, deep in the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps circling our tent, soft, deliberate steps on the pine needles and fallen leaves, a slow, measured pace, as if whatever was out there was taking its time, studying us. I held my breath and listened, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps stopped directly outside our tent wall, maybe 3 feet from my head. I could feel a presence there, something large and patient waiting. The fabric of the tent wall moved slightly, as if something was breathing on it. I wanted to wake Sarah, but some primitive instinct told me to stay perfectly still. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time became elastic in that darkness, before the footsteps resumed, completing their circuit around our shelter before fading into the forest. When I finally fell back asleep, my dreams were full of dark water and things with too many teeth. I woke to gray dawn light filtering through the tent fabric and the smell of coffee. Sarah was already up, tending a small fire outside. She looked rested, cheerful even, humming under her breath as she stirred something in our camping pot. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said when I emerged from the tent. "I found some wild blueberries. Thought we could have them with the oatmeal." The berries were small and dark, almost black, scattered on a flat rock beside the fire. I'd never seen blueberries quite that color, but Sarah seemed pleased with her discovery. "How'd you sleep?" I asked, accepting a cup of coffee. "Like a rock. Best night's sleep I've had in months." She smiled, but something was off about it. The expression didn't quite reach her eyes, and she held it a beat too long. "What about you?" I almost mentioned the footsteps, then decided against it. The morning sun made the night's fears seem foolish and paranoid. "Fine. Just took a while to get used to the quiet." We broke camp after breakfast, planning to hike the loop trail that would take us to Bridal Veil Falls before circling back to the lake. Sarah seemed different in the morning light, more animated than she'd been in months, but in a way that felt slightly foreign. She chattered constantly as we hiked, pointing out plants and birds with an enthusiasm I didn't remember her having for nature. "Look at that," she said, stopping beside a massive cedar that had fallen across a small creek. "The way the moss has grown over it, it's like nature is reclaiming it, you know? Like it was never separate from the forest at all." Her voice had a dreamy quality, and when she looked at the fallen tree, her eyes seemed to lose focus for a moment, as if she was seeing something I couldn't. The trail to the falls was well marked but poorly maintained. Fallen logs blocked the path every few hundred yards, forcing us to climb over or detour around them. Some looked freshly fallen, their splintered ends still weeping sap, but others were ancient, their bark long gone and their wood silver with age. "This is taking longer than I expected," I said, checking my watch. "We'd been hiking for 3 hours and covered maybe half the distance we should have." Sarah consulted our map, a Forest Service publication that had worked fine yesterday. But now the ink seemed smeared, the trail markers unclear. Some of the topographic lines appeared to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "The map's screwed up," she said, frowning. "These elevations don't make sense." We pressed on, following what we hoped was the main trail. The forest grew denser, the canopy so thick that it felt like walking through a green tunnel. The air became still and heavy, pregnant with the promise of rain that never came. It was past noon when we reached what should have been Bridal Veil Falls. Instead of the thundering cascade described in our guidebook, we found a thin trickle of water seeping down a moss-covered rock face. The pool at its base was choked with algae and floating debris. "This can't be right," Sarah said, but she was smiling that strange, too-wide smile again. "Although it's beautiful in its own way, don't you think? The decay, the way everything's going back to the earth." I stared at her. "Sarah, this isn't the falls. We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere." "Does it matter?" she asked, her voice dreamy again. "We're here, together. Isn't that what's important?" Something cold crawled up my spine. This wasn't like Sarah at all. She was methodical, practical, the kind of person who always double-checked directions and kept detailed trip itineraries. The woman standing beside me seemed content to wander aimlessly through an increasingly hostile wilderness. "Let's head back," I said. "Try to retrace our steps." But the trail behind us had changed. Where we'd descended a gentle slope an hour earlier, now there was only a steep granite face covered in loose scree. The path we'd followed simply didn't exist anymore. "That's impossible," I muttered, turning in a slow circle. The forest pressed in on all sides, a wall of green that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. Sarah laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a cemetery. "Nothing's impossible out here, James. The forest has its own rules." We spent the rest of the day trying to find our way back to the lake, but every trail led to another dead end. Every landmark we thought we recognized proved to be somewhere else entirely. The sun set without us ever seeing familiar ground. We made camp in a small clearing beside a stream that tasted wrong. Not polluted exactly, but flat and lifeless, like water that had been sitting in a glass for weeks. Sarah didn't seem bothered by any of it. If anything, she seemed energized by our predicament, her eyes bright with an almost feverish excitement. "Isn't this an adventure?" she said as we set up the tent in the failing light. "Just the two of us against the wilderness." I tried to start a fire, but the wood wouldn't catch. Even the driest kindling I could find just smoldered and went out, filling the air with acrid smoke that made my eyes water. After an hour of trying, I gave up and we ate cold food from cans, huddled together as darkness fell around us like a closing fist. The night sounds were different here. Where the lake had been silent, this place buzzed with activity, but not the normal activity of a healthy forest. The sounds were wrong, chittering that was almost like laughter, the snap of branches that seemed too deliberate to be random, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Do you hear that?" I asked Sarah. "Hear what?" But she was smiling, that unsettling smile again, and in the dim light of our camp lantern her teeth looked too sharp. I lay awake long into the night, listening to the wrongness all around us. Sometime near what felt like midnight, I heard Sarah get up and leave the tent. I waited for her to come back, but she didn't. After what felt like hours, I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. She was standing at the edge of our clearing, perfectly still, facing the forest. Her posture was wrong, too rigid, like a marionette held by invisible strings. As I watched, she began to walk into the trees, moving with the same mechanical gait. "Sarah!" I called, but she didn't respond. I grabbed the flashlight and stumbled after her, crashing through underbrush that seemed to grab at my clothes and skin. Branches whipped across my face, drawing blood, and roots caught my feet, sending me sprawling again and again. The beam of my flashlight picked up glimpses of her red jacket ahead, always just at the edge of visibility. She moved through the forest with an impossible silence, never disturbing a branch or snapping a twig, while I blundered behind her like a drunk elephant. The chase went on for what felt like hours. My lungs burned, my legs cramped, and still I couldn't catch up to her. It was as if she was always exactly the same distance ahead, no matter how fast I ran or how many shortcuts I tried to take. Then, suddenly, she was gone. I stood in a small clearing, sweeping the flashlight beam back and forth, calling her name until my voice was hoarse. Nothing. The forest had swallowed her completely. I spent the rest of the night searching, moving in increasingly desperate circles through terrain that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. Twice I found our camp again, only to leave it and somehow end up somewhere completely different. Dawn found me exhausted and lost, sitting on a fallen log beside a creek I didn't recognize. My water bottle was empty, my hands were cut and bleeding from fighting through blackberry vines, and I had no idea where I was or how to find Sarah. That's when I heard her calling my name. "James! James, where are you?" Her voice came from upstream, sounding weak and frightened. I ran toward it, crashing through the underbrush, hope and relief flooding through me despite everything that had happened. I found her sitting on a rock beside a deep pool, her clothes torn and muddy, her hair tangled with leaves and twigs. She looked up when she heard me coming, and the relief on her face was so genuine, so perfectly Sarah, that I almost forgot about the night's strangeness. "Oh, God, James, I'm so glad you found me," she said, standing and stumbling toward me. "I got up to pee and got turned around in the dark. I've been wandering all night." I pulled her into my arms, feeling her solid warmth, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. She felt real. She felt like Sarah, and I wanted desperately to believe that everything else had been just paranoia and sleep deprivation. "I was so scared," she whispered against my chest. "I thought I'd never find you again." But as I held her, I noticed things. Small things that might have been nothing, or might have been everything. Her skin was cold, not just cool from the night air, but deeply, unnaturally cold, like something that had been buried in earth. When she spoke, her breath didn't mist in the morning air the way mine did, and there was a smell clinging to her, faint but unmistakable, the sweet sick odor of things long dead. "Let's get back to camp," I said, pulling away from her. "Get you warmed up." She smiled, that same too wide smile from yesterday, and nodded. "That sounds perfect." But we couldn't find our camp. We walked for hours through forest that seemed to rearrange itself behind us, following streams that led nowhere and trails that simply ended without warning. Sarah didn't seem bothered by this. If anything, she seemed to know exactly where she was going, even when she claimed to be as lost as I was. "This way," she'd say with confidence, leading us down paths that hadn't existed moments before. By midday, I was beginning to suspect we were walking in circles. I started watching for landmarks, a distinctively shaped rock, a tree with unusual scars, and within an hour, I was sure. We'd passed the same boulder 3 times, approached from different directions each time. "Sarah," I said, stopping beside the boulder. "I think we're lost." She turned to look at me, and for just a moment her expression was completely blank, as if she'd forgotten who I was or why we were there. Then the smile returned, bright and loving and wrong. "Don't be silly," she said. "I know exactly where we are." That night we made camp beside another stream, in another clearing that felt too much like the one we'd used before. I managed to get a fire started this time, but the flames burned blue instead of orange, and the smoke rose straight up in a perfect column despite the wind. Sarah sat across from me, watching the fire with an intensity that made my skin crawl. In the blue light, her skin looked pale and waxy, and her eyes reflected the flames like an animal's. "Sarah," I said carefully, "are you feeling all right?" "I feel wonderful," she said without looking away from the fire. "I feel more alive than I have in years." "You seem different since last night." She finally looked at me and her smile was all teeth. "Different? How?" I couldn't put my finger on it, couldn't articulate the wrongness that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a fever. "I don't know. Just different." She laughed, that wind chime sound that made my teeth ache. "Maybe you're the one who's different, James. Maybe the forest is showing you things you never noticed before." We went to bed early, but I didn't sleep. I lay beside her in the double sleeping bag, listening to her breathe, except she wasn't breathing. Her chest rose and fell in a perfect rhythm, but no air moved past her lips. When I held my hand near her mouth and nose, I felt nothing. Sometime, deep in the night, she spoke without opening her eyes. "I know you're awake, James." I froze, not answering. "I can hear your heart beating. Such a fast, frightened rhythm, like a rabbit's." Her voice was different now, flatter, more mechanical, as if someone was reading lines from a script. "Who are you?" I whispered. She opened her eyes then, and they reflected the dim starlight filtering through the tent fabric like mirrors. "I'm Sarah. I'm your girlfriend. I love you." The words were right, but they sounded rehearsed, like someone reciting facts they'd memorized but didn't understand. "What happened to you out there?" "Nothing happened. I got lost, and then you found me. We're having a camping trip. We're trying to save our relationship." She sat up, and in the dim light I could see that her smile was too wide, stretching her face in ways that human faces shouldn't stretch. "Isn't that right, James? Isn't that why we came here?" I slipped out of the sleeping bag as quietly as I could, but she grabbed my wrist with fingers that felt like ice. "Where are you going?" I need some air." Her grip tightened and I felt bones grind together in my wrist. "Stay. We need to talk about our relationship." I yanked free and stumbled out of the tent, my heart hammering against my ribs. The forest around our camp was perfectly silent, not even the whisper of wind in the trees. Above, the stars were wrong. Constellations I didn't recognize, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Behind me, I heard the tent zipper opening. "James," the thing that wore Sarah's face called softly. "Come back to bed." I ran. I crashed through the forest without thought or direction, driven by pure animal terror. Branches tore at my clothes and skin. Roots caught my feet and sent me sprawling. But I kept moving. Behind me, I could hear it following. Not running, but walking with that same deliberate pace, as if it knew it didn't need to hurry. "James," it called, and its voice carried impossibly far through the trees. "You can't leave me here. I'm lost. I need you." The voice was perfect now, exactly like Sarah's, full of the fear and vulnerability that would normally have me running toward her instead of away. But I'd seen its eyes, felt the wrongness of its touch, and no amount of vocal mimicry could erase that. I ran until my lungs felt like they were full of broken glass, until my legs wouldn't carry me any further. I collapsed beside a massive cedar, gasping for breath, listening for sounds of pursuit. The forest was silent. I waited there until dawn, pressed against the tree's rough bark, jumping at every small sound. As the gray light strengthened, I could see that I was in a part of the forest I'd never seen before. The trees here were older, more massive, their trunks disappearing into the mist overhead. Some were so large that my camp chair could have fit comfortably in the hollows between their roots. And carved into the bark of the largest tree, about 8 feet off the ground, was a message. They wear the faces of the lost trust. Nothing that returns. M.H. 1987. Below it, in fresher cuts, Don't let it follow you home. J.K. 2003. Get out while you can. Sarah R. 2019. My blood turned to ice water. Sarah R. That was Sarah's handwriting, her characteristic way of making the capital R, but it was dated 5 years ago, and we'd never been here before. I heard footsteps approaching through the trees, slow and deliberate. The thing that looked like Sarah emerged from the morning mist, her clothes torn and dirty, her face a mask of concern and relief. James, thank God I found you. You were having a nightmare, thrashing around, and when I tried to wake you, you ran off into the forest. She approached slowly, hands outstretched. You're safe now. I'm here. The performance was flawless. If I hadn't seen the carving, hadn't felt the wrongness of her touch, I might have believed it. The creature had studied Sarah, learned her mannerisms, her expressions, the exact tone of voice she used when she was worried about me. Stay away from me, I said, backing around the massive tree, its face crumpled in perfect mimicry of hurt and confusion. James, what's wrong? It's me. It's Sarah. Sarah's dead, isn't she? The thing tilted its head, a gesture so perfectly Sarah that my heart broke a little. What are you talking about? I'm right here. What happened to her when she walked into the forest? For just a moment, the mask slipped. The thing's expression went completely blank, and when it spoke, its voice was flat and emotionless. She fed the trees. Then the mask was back, and it was crying. Sarah's tears, reaching for me with Sarah's hands. James, please, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm scared. Something's wrong with you. I turned and ran again, but this time I had a destination. The carvings had mentioned not letting it follow me home, which meant there was a way out of this place. I just had to find it before the thing wearing Sarah's face caught up to me. The forest seemed to fight me at every step. Paths vanished as I tried to follow them. Streams led me in circles, and the compass on my watch spun wildly without settling on any direction. But I kept moving, driven by the knowledge that whatever had happened to Sarah was waiting to happen to me if I stopped. I found the parking area just as the sun reached its zenith, shining down through a gap in the canopy that hadn't been there when we'd arrived. Our car sat exactly where we'd left it, covered in a thick layer of pollen and dust as if it had been sitting there for months instead of days. The keys were in my pocket where I'd left them. The engine started on the first try. As I pulled out of the parking area, I saw the thing that looked like Sarah standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. It didn't try to follow, didn't call out or cry. It just stood there with that too wide smile, and in the rearview mirror, I watched it grow smaller and smaller until the forest swallowed it completely. I drove for 6 hours without stopping, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed place. I called the police from the first town I reached, told them my girlfriend was missing in the Olympic National Forest. They organized a search, brought in dogs and helicopters, but they never found any trace of Sarah Rodriguez. They never found any trace of Lake Serene, either. According to the Forest Service, there is no Lake Serene in that part of the Olympic National Forest. Never has been. The trail we followed doesn't exist on any official map, and the parking area where we left the car is just an abandoned logging road that's been closed to the public for 15 years. I tried to convince them, showed them the pictures on Sarah's camera, but the memory card was corrupted. Every single image was just static and distortion, as if something had deliberately destroyed the evidence of our trip. The thing that really broke me was going through Sarah's apartment afterward, packing up her belongings for her family. I found her journal, and on the last page she'd made plans for our camping trip. But according to the date on the entry, she'd written it 5 years ago. 5 years before we'd even met. I moved across the country after that, changed my name, tried to build a new life, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I hear her voice calling my name, and sometimes I wake up to find muddy footprints on my bedroom floor, circling my bed like something was studying me while I slept. I've carved my own warning into a dozen trees in a dozen different forests. They wear the faces of the lost. Trust nothing that returns. But I know that someday, the thing that wears Sarah's face will find me. It's patient, and it's hungry, and it remembers the taste of love turned to terror. When it comes for me, it will smile with Sarah's smile and speak with Sarah's voice, and it will promise me everything I've lost if I'll just follow it back into the green darkness where nothing ever really dies. And God help me, part of me wants to go. Part of me has never stopped loving the thing that killed her. That's the real horror of it. Not just that Sarah is gone, but that something else has learned to love me with her voice, to want me with her heart, to need me with a hunger that will never be satisfied. Sometimes, in my weakest moments, I think that might be enough. Sometimes I catch myself driving toward the mountains and I have to pull over and remember why I ran. I have to remember that love isn't always enough, that some hungers can't be fed, and that the thing waiting for me in the forest isn't Sarah, no matter how perfectly it wears her face. But it's getting harder to remember why that matters, and I'm getting tired of running.